Amy? We're back in session and we'll move to our next committee, which is the Education, Innovation, and Charter Schools Committee, chaired by Miss Amy White. Ms. White.
Thank you, Chair Davis. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Amy White, and I chair the Education, Innovation, and Charter School Committee. Joining me in that responsibility is Ms. Jill Kamnitz, and we have several items for your review today. EICS 1 and EICS 2 are appeal panel recommendations. On Monday, August the 2nd, a panel of Board of Education members met to hear the appeals of 2 North Carolina charter schools whose charters were revoked during the July 8th Board of Education meeting. The recommendations from the panel will be shared with the full board today, a little bit later this afternoon in closed session, and we'll be back to you to share the information during the board's full meeting tomorrow. So let's move to EICS 3, which is the North Carolina Access Annual Report. And we are so excited, board members, colleagues at your table. You should have a fold over annual review. And coming to the podium is Mr. Jay Whalen, who's going to lead us through the presentation. Welcome, Mr. Whalen. And we are super excited to hear what you have to share with us today.
I am very excited as well. It's great to be here. Good afternoon, board members, Superintendent Truett. I am Jay Whalen, I'm the program administrator for the NC Access program. I have a few of my team members here, audience, and then also online. We also have some amazing school leaders, both here in person and virtual as well, to share some of the amazing things that they've been doing at their schools and to report on some of the progress that we've made over the past year. So you all have hard copies of the annual review. There's also a virtual copy in eBoard. And I'm excited to go through some of the highlights in today's presentation. Feel free to stop me at any time for questions. We'll also save some time at the end for questions as well. So just sort of a reminder of why our program exists. We have 3 overarching goals. The first is to increase the number of educationally disadvantaged students attending high quality charter schools throughout the state. The second is to develop a cohort of charter leaders who can develop and demonstrate best practices for serving educationally disadvantaged students. And then finally, to broadly disseminate those best practices and foster collaboration between charter schools and traditional public schools. And so I've mentioned this a lot before. I'll use the term educationally disadvantaged a lot. We're using the federal definition, which includes students who are economically disadvantaged, students with disabilities, English learners, students experiencing homelessness, immigrant students, and migrant students. So briefly to recap our year in review, and I'll go through some of these things in more detail. We are almost 3 years into our 5-year federal CSP award. On September 30th, we'll be 3 years into it. We were awarded $26.6 million in 2018, and then an additional $10 million in 2019 for a full award of $36.6 million. 90% of that goes directly to schools in the form of subgrants to increase the number of educationally disadvantaged students they serve and to provide better services for those students. In the second subgrant cycle last summer, we awarded an additional 33 subgrants, which brings our total to 42 subgrants at the end of this previous school year, and a total of $20.2 million. This board actually approved our third subgrant cycle this past July for an additional 19 subgrant awards. So we have officially met our goal of 60, but we still have some additional money remaining, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. But currently 42 schools are implementing across the state. And in the last year, nearly 1,500 more educationally disadvantaged students are now attending and enrolled in those high quality charter schools. And so I'll talk a little bit more about the specifics of those and break down some of those categories in just a minute. Another exciting piece of the program is our fellowship component. And so another cohort of fellows has completed the NC Access Fellowship, which is a year-long professional development program for subgrant leaders that are leading schools that have received subgrants. And then we also have a visiting fellows program to invite additional charter school leaders throughout the state. And then finally, we launched the NC Access program website. So NC Access program launched in October of 2020 to house not only information and resources for the program itself, but the best practices that are being developed by subgrantees are posted on our website, and we're continuing to build out that library. We also launched the Minority School Leaders Program, which I will talk about in a little bit as well, and started providing statewide professional development to all charter school staff and leaders across the state, regardless of their status in the program or not. And so to talk about goal one a little bit, the goal to increase the number of educationally disadvantaged students in charter schools, the ultimate goal is to award 60 subgrants to schools across the state committed to enrolling more and better serving educationally disadvantaged students. As I mentioned, through 2 cycles, we awarded 42 subgrants, and with the previous cycle this past July, an additional 19 subgrants were awarded. So we have officially reached that goal of 60. We do still have roughly $2.4 million remaining. So we will be able to go above and beyond that 60 with a few more subgrants in a future cycle. But as you'll see at the bottom, these are numbers from the end of the 2020-2021 school year, where we awarded 42 subgrants. 9 of those were for planning and implementation schools that were, when they were awarded, they were going into their planning year to launch their school. Some of those schools are now in operation. 14 schools were implementation only, so those were newly launched schools within the first 3 years of operation, and 19 schools were expansion schools, which are high-quality schools that seek to expand their enrollment to not only more students generally, but more educationally disadvantaged students. And so one area to note, we do have one replication school that was awarded in the previous cycle, the 3rd cycle, so it's not on this slide. And we do have a couple of replication applicants coming through the general charter school approval process. So those are high quality schools that are looking to replicate their model and start a brand new school based on an existing high quality model, which will open up a lot of seats across the state in those brand new schools as well. And so on the next slide, you'll see sort of the reach of the network. It's a little difficult to see the outline of the state, but the dots on the map represent numbers of schools in specific counties. So some of the urban counties, Charlotte, Mecklenburg, Wake County, Guilford County have some of the highest concentrations of subgrantees, but we do have subgrantees across the state operating in 22 different counties across the state, and that will only continue to grow when we update this with the additional 19 schools that were awarded this previous cycle. And so since the overall goal is obviously to increase access for educationally disadvantaged students, so there's a number of things that schools commit to when they join the program and they're awarded a subgrant. And that includes things like providing transportation, providing a comprehensive school lunch program, implementing a weighted lottery to increase access for educationally disadvantaged students, as well as comprehensive marketing and recruitment plans and the implementation of a parent and community advisory council. Our schools also propose to do a lot of other things, a lot of different wraparound services and a lot of supports for educationally disadvantaged students. But those required components are implemented by all schools to increase access for students. And as you'll see on the slide and in the report, over 8,500 educationally disadvantaged students are being served by both cohorts of schools currently, and that makes up about 41% of the population of those schools. And as I mentioned earlier, just this past year, an additional 1,500 educationally disadvantaged students were added to subgrantees. So in the chart on the right-hand side, you'll see that cohort added roughly 520 educationally disadvantaged students, and cohort 2 added over 900 educationally disadvantaged students in just this past school year alone. The 6 operating schools, just for context, in cohort 1 that were open added 250 educationally disadvantaged students in that first year. And the majority of those students are qualify as economically disadvantaged. And so you'll see those numbers sort of broken down in the bottom half of the chart on the screen. But they also represent a significant increase in students who are English learners and students with disabilities. And so just a reminder that students can qualify for more than one category. We count educationally disadvantaged students as any student that qualifies for one or more of those ED categories, but the majority of the students do qualify as economically disadvantaged. And so weighted lotteries are implemented as a mechanism to help those students get into these schools and have access to the schools, particularly for our high quality schools that have really long waiting lists. Schools are able to give additional weight to students who qualify as educationally disadvantaged to give them greater access and a better chance of being selected into the schools. And so what we typically see is schools adding more and more educationally disadvantaged students the longer they're in the program, just because of the way the timing works. Most schools don't have the weighted lottery in place for the first year that they're in the subgrant because of the approval process and when lotteries take place. So the longer that schools are in the program, the more impact they have to add those educationally disadvantaged students because the weighted lottery has been in place and has been in place longer. And as I mentioned, 100% of subgrantees have submitted comprehensive plans for transportation and lunch. And within just 1 to 2 years of operation, 50% of those schools have fully implemented those plans. So we obviously expect to see that go up over the years, but it is encouraging to see in just a short amount of time, a lot of those schools have fully implemented the comprehensive plan that they planned, knowing that those, particularly transportation, are historically difficult things to get off the ground for schools that haven't had them in the past. And so to make a quick note about racial diversity in schools, we do not have specific goals around racial diversity for the program. Our goals are specifically around educational disadvantages, because that is the goal of the CSP program at the federal level. And there's also no way to wait for race within a weighted lottery. But we do see a large commitment from our subgrantees in terms of increasing the racial diversity within their schools. And so the chart that you see on the left is the overall racial makeup of charter schools in the state over the last 10 years. And the percentage of students of color is nearly equal to the percentage of white students as of the last school year. But also the charts on the right, you can see that since the beginning of the NC Access program, subgrantee schools have added students of color at higher rates in every non-white subgroup than non-subgrantee schools. And that not to say that non-subgrantee schools are not doing, not having success in increasing their diversity as well, but the specific commitments that are made by subgrantees in their applications is sort of bearing out in the data as we see racial diversity across our subgrantees improving at a greater rate. So the second goal that I mentioned earlier, creating a cohort of leaders, ultimately we'll create a cohort of 160 leaders who go through our Access Fellowship and can develop and demonstrate best practices for serving educationally disadvantaged students. I think this is one of the most exciting pieces of the program. We know that the money is important and we know that the money helps, but the development that leaders are getting through the fellowship program, I think, is one of the most amazing pieces of this program. And so, as I mentioned, our second cohort just completed that fellowship this past year. We did have to conduct the entire fellowship virtually this past year. And I do have my colleague, Dr. Barbara O'Neill, on the line. I'll let her jump in if she has anything additional to add. She did an amazing job pivoting very quickly to host that and complete that virtually. But fellows attend monthly sessions throughout the year. We bring in state and national experts around a whole host of topics and serving different subgroups and different populations of students to better equip leaders to develop best practices, collaborate with each other, and then ultimately better serve those students. And through the first two cohorts that we have, which is ultimately 111 leaders so far, 100% of the fellows have indicated that as a result of going through the fellowship, they feel better prepared to serve educationally disadvantaged students in their schools. So to give you a better sense of the numbers at this point, as I mentioned, there are 111 leaders that have completed the fellowship to date. The majority of those come from subgrantee schools, so 84 of those are what we consider Access Fellows, 2 leaders from each subgrantee school. But we also launched 2 years ago the Visiting Fellows program and then fully implemented that this past year. So 12 Visiting Fellows, which are fellows that have been invited from schools that are not eligible for subgrants. So typically low or continually low performing schools, but really high performing dynamic leaders that we've known throughout the state that would benefit from this additional professional development. We invited them to join the fellowship. So we've had 12 of those fellows come through the program. And this past year, we also had the great opportunity to partner with another division in DPI and invite 2 leaders from traditional public schools using the state's restart model. So those schools that are given charter-like flexibility, given the state's restart model, we were able to invite 2 school leaders from those schools to join the fellowship and go through the professional development as well as they begin to implement some of the flexibilities that they're afforded and also learn from some of the great experts that we're able to bring in. And then the final piece is the Aspiring Minority Leaders Program, and I'll talk about that a little bit more in a second, but the 13 leaders that we were able to bring into that program in our partnership with Appalachian State also completed the Access Fellowship this past year. And we'll continue to grow that program, the Visiting Fellows Program, and hopefully the Restart Fellows Program as all part of the larger effort to build out this cohort of leaders across the state that have now been through this intensive development process together and collaborated with each other. And so in terms of the development itself, as I mentioned, we bring in state and national experts for a whole host of issues. We've had some great speakers. We brought in the CEO and founder of Statesman College Prep from Washington, D.C. to talk about transformational leadership for Black and brown boys. You were fine on the previous slide. We've had members from the AHA Process Incorporated group come and speak about better serving and cooperating with Hispanic students and their families. We've had equity-based MTSS for all students, identifying gifted students who are experiencing poverty. And what we realized was this is amazing professional development and amazing resources, but is there a way to share some of this more broadly as well? And so what we launched this past spring was additional equity-focused PD for the entire charter sector. So we started offering professional development, virtual professional development sessions open to any charter school staff or leader around the state to register for and attend. We hosted over 20 sessions, which accounted for over 60 hours. In the spring, all of it is paid for by the NC Access program and free to participants, and had over 300 participants participate in that this spring. And so we're continuing to build that out to offer additional development opportunities and resources this coming year as well. And one super exciting piece, which I've mentioned already, is the Aspiring Minority Leaders Program. And Dr. O'Neill on our team spearheaded this effort last fall, but in a partnership with Appalachian State, we have at this point recruited and enrolled 13 aspiring leaders of color in the MSA add-on licensure program at Appalachian State. So these are assistant principals, deans, teacher leaders, other administrators currently in charter schools who have leadership aspirations and would make amazing charter school leaders in the future and are already amazing charter school leaders, but do not have NC principal licensures. And so through a partnership with Appalachian State, we are paying for those leaders to go through the add-on licensure program. So not only do they participate in the Access Fellowship with us, they're going through the add-on licensure program with Appalachian State and going through the coursework, and then they'll be able to use the internship experience through that program to do it at their home school, and their principal will be the acting mentor in that program as well. So that's another program that we hope to expand. Our goal ultimately when we started this was to put 20 leaders through that program. And so 13 was more than when we expected in the first year. So we hope to continue to expand that program in the course of the next couple of years. And so the third overarching goal is to broadly disseminate best practices. And as I mentioned earlier, we launched our program website, ncaccessprogram.com, last October. We work with a partner organization that works with our subgrantees throughout the year to take the best practices that they're developing and implementing in their schools, and then turn them into what we call best practice implementation summaries. So an easily readable, digestible document that anyone can go to our website and download for best practices that are being implemented in schools to better serve educationally disadvantaged students. So we have practices like school-based healthcare, reaching out to and supporting particularly non-English speaking communities and populations within the community, and a whole host of other things, particularly around marketing and recruitment, things around weighted lottery, as I mentioned, and you'll hear one of our schools present this afternoon about supports for particularly Black boys and some of the data that they were able to glean from assessment information and what they were able to do to support those students, and particularly Black boys in their school. And then also our professional development information and registration is on that website. And so that's sort of the hub of where all this collaboration and dissemination happens. We do hope to host a lot more collaborative events and conferences. Obviously, COVID hampered our ability to do that to the extent that we wanted to in the past school year. But now that we're building out this cohort of leaders, we really want to leverage those leaders in future years and those fellows to collaborate with each other and expand the program even more broadly to schools that are not specifically in the program. And so very quickly, a financial review, just to kind of give you a sense of where we are a few years into this. As I mentioned, COVID-19 did have a significant impact on the implementation of the program. We did transition everything to virtual. So monitoring, technical assistance, fellowship, all of that was conducted virtually. Subgrantees also with the enormity of things that they had to deal with and experience this past year. Their expenditures did come in lower than projected, but we do expect that to rebound over the course of the next couple of years, particularly as transportation programs begin to ramp back up and other services that schools are providing for students as they return to the building continue to ramp back up. So you'll see we've expended officially a little over $4 million, but we've obligated over $20 million, and that includes those subgrant funds that have yet to be reimbursed but have been awarded and obligated to schools. And actually with the addition of the July meeting and the subgrants that we awarded, that's an additional 10.8 million that we've obligated to of the entire 36 million at this point. And just to give you a little bit of sense of how money is being spent, most of it is being spent on instructional costs. So 66% of all expenditures are instructional in nature. We did divide the expenses as instructional or support. 33% of those go towards instructional technology and equipment. So as you can imagine, we saw a major investment in devices for students, not only given the pandemic, but even before that, people had a real big interest in providing technology and access to technology to students. Most of our schools going to one-to-one ratios and providing those supports for students both in and out of the classroom. 33%, oh, I'm sorry, I said that already. The instructional supplies and materials is also a big category that we see investments in. So 22% of all expenditures go towards instructional supplies and equipment. So curriculum materials, classroom consumable materials, things like that teachers are using in the classroom for instructional purposes is also a major component of the program. And then the third highest category overall is 20% of all expenditures is the professional fees and contracted services. And that can include a lot of things, but the majority of that is professional development. We've seen a huge investment in professional development at the school level. So sort of piggybacking on a lot of things that happen in the fellowship, we have people book the speakers that we had at the fellowship and bring them to the school. And across the board, we've seen a large investment in professional development for teachers and staff. But that can also include additional wraparound services for schools, things that schools wouldn't have been able to do before. This sort of upfront funding allows them to start programs that then their increased enrollment over the next couple of years will make sustainable for them. And then I'll just mention as well as some of the support costs that are outlined here. Buying buses is a big investment that we've seen people make, and part of the professional fees and contracted services is also contracting for that bus service. But we've seen a big investment in the transportation piece. There's limitations around how people can spend money for food service. They can't buy food and kitchen equipment. So there's a lot more sort of offsetting those costs for the operational budget by investing our money in the transportation services, because buying buses and those sort of big upfront investments are things that they can do with CSP funds. And so what we're focused on next, what you'll actually hear in a minute, Aaron Huggins from the Friday Institute is here. We've partnered with the Friday Institute to do an external program evaluation of the NC Access program itself to help us get better and improve our services. And so you'll hear a little bit about their findings and some of the things that we're thinking about for the next year. But really a lot of our focus now that we've awarded most of the subgrant funding and there's still a little bit more, but really holding schools accountable for what they said they were going to do is becoming really important to us. So holding schools accountable to their enrollment projections, the goals that they said that they were going to meet and the progress that they're making towards those. We'll be doing robust monitoring throughout this year and really beginning in this fall, and then also technical assistance for those schools. So additional ways that we can support schools to meet their goals and meet their enrollment projections. So sort of separate from the fellowship piece, but how are we specifically helping these schools implement over the course of the next couple of years. As I mentioned earlier, we really want to leverage the experience of the Access Fellows. So conferences and collaborative events that are either hosted by the Office of Charter Schools or that are just sort of organically happening throughout the state. We want to really leverage the expertise of those fellows and use them as resources and mentors for other leaders throughout the state to really increase that collaboration throughout the state. And then finally, ensuring that access to curriculum and equitable educational environments is paramount. We know that getting students in the school is just sort of step one. And obviously, the absence of state testing doesn't give us a great window into sort of the educational outcomes yet, but we've been working with our schools at some of the internal metrics they have and really want to think about once the students are in the seats, how are they being supported and how is that leading to equitable outcomes for those students as well. So those are really kind of our priorities for not only this year, but the next couple of years. And so I am going to turn it over to Aaron Huggins next from the Friday Institute, but I do want to pause if there are any questions from me at the moment. I'm happy to answer questions.
Anybody have a question for Mr. Whalen? Mr. Duncan?
Thank you for the report and thank you for the work on it. It appears that the board's being asked to approve submission of the report to the Department of Education. I couldn't tell from the way it was described if that approval is required because the report has to be submitted, or it's just you may want to submit the report that's been provided. So that was unclear to me. Could you give a little clarification for us on that?
Sure. It is not required to be submitted to the U.S. Department of Ed. We have additional annual performance reports and interim reports that we submit that are sort of specific to the program and sort of wholly separate from this. We will submit it as additional evidence for the program. Generally, a lot of the reports that we submit are around the financials, the enrollment, and sort of the nuts and bolts of the program. So it is not required to be submitted, but we will as additional resources as sort of addition to the monitoring reports that we submit.
So was it prepared for purposes of submission?
No, it was prepared for you all. It was prepared to provide an update on the progress, and we'll do that annually for this board, for the Charter School Advisory Board, and just more broadly for the North Carolina community. It is not prepared specifically for the U.S. Department of Ed.
There was a couple more questions, if you don't mind. There was a reference on one of the slides about collaborative events and conference presentations that were made for purposes of discussing best practices. Who are the invitees to those conferences?
So there's a number of ways that can happen. One of the requirements of the program is that fellows host collaborative events and participate in present at state or national conferences. And so obviously that hasn't happened much in the past year, but any conferences that fellows wish to participate at that are either state or national conferences, things that are hosted by the Office of Charter Schools, we will invite fellows to participate at. So any type of conference that any fellow wants to participate at, and that data is actually being collected by the Friday Institute. But anything that one of those fellows wants to participate at, they're welcome to. And then hosting collaborative events at their schools, we encourage schools to invite other charter schools in the area, other traditional public schools. We've had a couple of schools who have actually started that in the Charlotte-Mecklenburg area and had representatives of the Charlotte-Mecklenburg LEA as well as other charter schools in the area come to those events to discuss some of the challenges and things that they're dealing with and best practices as well. So there's a lot of different ways that can look, and there's not a specific type of school or type of person that is invited to that. We encourage them to invite whoever is in their local community or whoever would benefit from it.
Last question goes back to slide 13, if you could go there just for 1 second. There's category under professional fees and contracted services, 14% is listed as support. Then there's some salaries and employee benefits of about 4% that are listed as support. Can you give us a better idea about what those support items would be?
Sure. So salaries and benefits are typically for school leaders or administration coming on before the school opens. You can't spend salaries and benefits once a school opens, which is why there's no instructional support or benefits, because once a school becomes operational, that's the only time then instructional fees would be incurred. So the support salaries and benefits are for school leaders coming on in a planning year to essentially launch the school. So the CSP program gives some latitude to help support that cost. The professional fees and contracted services, as I mentioned, that could be a lot of different things. Some of that is startup costs. So, partnering with marketing and recruitment coordinators. You'll hear some of that today, actually. So bringing on some contractors to help with some of those outreach programs that a school can't initially afford, but as the enrollment grows, then they might bring that stuff in-house. Contracting for bus services would fall under that. Some of the other wraparound services that are not directly instructional, but would be additional support services for students. It could look like a lot of things, but particularly they are providing support services that the school cannot otherwise afford, but as the school grows, then will be rolled into the operating budget. A big chunk of that comes from contracting bus services for schools that are just starting out with bus transportation.
Thank you.
Yeah, let's see, Superintendent Truett.
Thank you, Chair White. Thank you so much for this report. This has just been fascinating to learn about. My question is specific to slide 14, which I believe is the next slide. The fourth bullet says ensuring access to curriculum and equitable educational environments. Can you just expand a little bit on how curriculum is being defined as well as equitable educational environments? And I asked this in light of the conversation we had this morning, where we discussed briefly the link between equitable standards and equitable curriculum. So I'm just hoping you can elucidate a little bit there.
Sure. And so that's not a specific reference to any particular curriculum or what a school is teaching. I think really what we're looking for is there were a lot of things proposed at how students are going to be supported, particularly educationally disadvantaged students. And so what we know is that students from low-income backgrounds score on average lower on state tests, and non-white students on average score lower on state tests as well. So what we really want to look at as part of our monitoring and support is, now that the students are in the building, how is what you presented in terms of the curriculum and education plan supporting those students? Are the outcomes equitable? Are they making gains? And is it not just, okay, the students are in the building, but like, now what? Is what you said, because part of our application is what is the educational plan to support these students when they're here? What are the support services available? So is the tutoring that was proposed, are the educational supports, the curriculum, the resources supports, are those leading to outcomes for students and growth for those students?
Just follow up briefly.
Yes.
So does that mean that when you talk about supports, does that mean supports to help teachers with planning and execution of curriculum?
It can mean both. Some of it is professional development and resources for teachers. Some of it is curriculum materials and supplies that are being purchased directly for students through access funds. And so we want to make sure that as students are, the goal is to get students into these schools, but then also to better serve them and to make sure that the education program of the school is supporting these students in the same way that it's supporting students who are more affluent or scoring higher.
Yeah, I guess I'm wondering to what extent the supports are given to the teachers in these schools.
From us?
Mm-hmm.
So what we do is more of a monitoring and support in terms of, are there additional resources? Are there additional ways that we can help connect you with people at DPI, other divisions within the agency that would help provide development for teachers? We're not making recommendations for any type of curriculum or supports that they would provide, but they proposed schools proposed a wide array of things in their applications to us, and we want to make sure that what they propose is leading to the outcomes that they also proposed in their application.
Thank you very much.
And I just want to add, this is Barbara O'Neill, that equitable education also include making sure that every student will have access to technology. And what we learned during COVID is that the inequities there. So we made sure that our schools spent money on providing technology and providing hotspots so everybody would have access. We had schools that said there were 4 kids in the house and all 4 of them were sharing one laptop or one tablet. So we made sure that there was one for everybody and they had internet access.
Thank you.
Madam Chair,
I believe that's Mr. Hall. Yes, sir.
Thank you, ma'am. Just a quick clarification from the gentleman. On one of your slides, you say that northcarolina.accessprogram.com, that is the site where all the best practices are housed. Am I correct?
Correct.
And anyone can access that without a code to get in?
Correct.
Okay, thank you. And I guess my next question is, you're bringing in speakers from outside, especially the gentleman from the school in DC. I'm aware that, is that open to anyone or is just closed to the charter school people when you bring in speakers like that?
So typically we bring those in for the fellowship. We've had a lot of schools
Gotcha.
to
Okay.
those individuals and bring them in externally for their full staffs. But a lot of those are specific to the fellowship program.
Okay, thank you.
Any further questions?
Dr.
Dr. Oxendine?
Thank you so much. Just a quick kind of a follow-up to the superintendent's question. I would imagine that ensuring access to curriculum, this is something that the grant is going to ensure happens led by the schools themselves. I'm wondering if that could also entail like an AIG enrichment curriculum.
So it can encompass a lot of things. I think what I meant by that bullet is part of our monitoring and support is going to be having conversations with schools, obviously monitoring the specific goals and enrollments of the school, but also some of the goals that they propose in terms of, a lot of schools did propose academic achievement goals for students. And so part of our monitoring is to also look at that and make sure progress is being made towards that and sort of ensuring that the school is providing
Right.
these equitable.
Yes, I'm clear that your office is not promoting a particular curriculum of such that you're monitoring to make sure that there's emphasis on those areas.
Mhm.
Okay, good, thank you.
Okay, it looks like we're ready to hear from Erin Huggins.
Great.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me to present to you today. I'm Erin Huggins. I'm a research associate at the Friday Institute for Educational Innovation at NC State, and I have been leading the program evaluation for the NC Access program this year. So this evaluation included an examination of both the implementation of the program during the 2020 and 21 school year, as well as the impacts related to specific performance goals that were laid out by the program. Due to the impacts of COVID-19, some of the data were not available for evaluation purposes this year, but we've collected what we can. So data for this evaluation included quantitative state level data, data from surveys, interviews, and focus groups, program materials and artifacts, and data analytics from the program's website. And one of the key activities for the NC Access program was to provide these monthly Fellowship Institute workshops. Due to COVID, as has been stated before, all of these were held virtually. And while we found that this was a barrier to overall collaboration, we did find that participation in the Fellows program had tremendously positive impacts on the NC Access Fellows overall. And specifically, they mentioned how efficient and effective the processes and components of the Fellows workshops were. So particularly, they pointed out that participation gave them very tangible strategies and best practices, as well as funding needed to support those efforts to recruit and retain, and then provide that equitable access for educationally disadvantaged students. They also talked a lot about how it helped them develop these strong peer networks, and that combined with the Fellows Institute trainings helped school leaders to shift their overall mindsets and improve the confidence of them to serve educationally disadvantaged students and then disseminate those best practices effectively. And then from there, many of these schools worked very hard to reimagine their own core values and their school culture. They worked to improve their marketing and communication to diverse student populations and worked to find some effective ways for closing achievement gaps. And so through all of this, most of the schools felt that they were able to improve outcomes for educationally disadvantaged students. So when looking at some of the specific resources and supports that were provided by the program, several emerged as key to increasing awareness, equitable access, academic support, and wraparound services. And some of these we've already talked a little bit about. So the marketing strategies that were shared through the program and specifically through the Fellows workshops were very valuable for providing information to the targeted families about the supports that the schools could provide. And many of these supports focused on removing those economic barriers for students and their families. For example, providing meals and transportation to and from school. And then the weighted lotteries ensured that schools were reserving enough space for the educationally disadvantaged students that they had planned for. NCXS also helped participating schools focus on the academic supports that we just talked about to meet the needs of their students. So in addition to providing professional development for staff, they made it possible to add curriculum and technology to their classrooms. Technology was especially crucial this past year. And then in some cases, they even extended those supports to providing things like guidance counseling to support student social and emotional well-being. So trying to provide for the whole student. And then several schools went beyond program requirements, and they were using some of the funding to provide these wraparound services for students. So they were providing before care and after care programs, breakfast, remote learning for students, remote learning support such as Chromebooks and hotspots, and also extended food services for families. And so these services were especially crucial during this very, very unique year. So the NC Access Fellows did identify some of the potential barriers to implementing the program as it was originally designed. And as you can imagine, almost all of them involve the COVID-19 pandemic and its impacts on schools during this past school year. So the program and schools attempted when possible to address most of these issues that you can see listed. For example, one school noted that flexibility with using funding allowed them to purchase technology so that they could provide one-to-one devices to students so that they could use that during remote learning. And that wasn't the only school. Many, many schools did this. Other schools have used flexible approaches to providing transportation. So some have hired companies to manage buses or provided staggered starting times for elementary, middle, and high school so they can use the same buses for all three levels. And even with the move to remote workshops, most of the NC Access Fellows did indicate that the workshops were really effective in helping them develop best strategies for meeting those needs of disadvantaged students. And they found especially that the speakers and the extended read-ins they were given were very engaging and inspiring for them. And so a lot of this is going to be a little repetitive, so I'll try to keep it short. But when looking at overall program impacts, I did want to point out it's really important to keep in mind that we're only in year 2 of a 5-year program, and looking at sustainability and long-term change takes time. And so looking at the overall goals of the program, we see that they're all moving in the right direction, and we will continue to monitor them both formatively and summatively as time goes on. So one of the key goals of the NC Access program was to expand the number of high-quality charter schools that are serving educationally disadvantaged students. And as stated before, 42 schools participated in the program as of June, and the program's already chosen and awarded the next cohort, which brings their total to 60. Unfortunately, we didn't really have accountability data to include in our analysis this year, but we did look back, and for the schools that were open in the 2018 and 19 school year, 82% of those schools that were participating in the program were considered high quality as we measured them by their performance grades and their academic growth scores. And then looking at enrollment of educationally disadvantaged students, 78% of those schools that were open in the 2019 and 1920 school year showed growth in the number of educationally disadvantaged students that they had enrolled in their school. Looking at overall enrollments has been a little bit tricky this year, but we examined both data, state data from CEDARS, and we examined self-reported data from the schools themselves. And we found that when we were looking at data from the state, approximately 38% of the schools were showing that they were meeting their enrollment projections for this year. And then when we were when the schools provided information to us, it showed that about 50% of them were meeting their enrollment projections. And after discussions with the program and with the schools, we feel that the school reported data is likely a better measure of the true number of educationally disadvantaged students, but we're going to continue to examine both the state and the school reported data in the years to come. Another goal of the program was to ultimately increase the number of schools that are serving more than 50% of educationally disadvantaged students at their school. And we found that about 38% of the schools that were open last year met that goal. And it's important to keep in mind that enrollment projections, when looking at these enrollment projections, most of the schools that were open in the 2020 and 21 school year had already conducted those open enrollments prior to even knowing they were going to participate in the program, because those typically take place in the early spring. And combining that with the turbulence of maneuvering through this pandemic, we're not terribly surprised that enrollment numbers were lower than what schools had projected. We are really interested to see how those numbers have changed in the upcoming school year. And so we are planning to re-examine those in September or October to see if we see any substantial increases from cohort 1 and 2 schools. And then we also looked at examining the barriers that have been removed for educationally disadvantaged students. And we found that 100% of the NC Access Fellows did submit the required weighted lotteries, transportation plans, and school lunch plans. As of June, 83% of those weighted lotteries had been approved, and 60% of the schools were either fully or partially implementing them. We found that 77% of the schools were either fully or partially implementing their transportation plans, and 88% were fully or partially implementing those school lunch plans and had plans to fully start that this coming school year. Unfortunately, no state level achievement data were available for this analysis. We can go back to the first slide. I've still got 2 more bullets. We did find that 100% of the NC Access current and former fellows reported greater confidence to develop and implement strategies for improving educational outcomes for disadvantaged students. And 89% of the schools said that they have been disseminating best practices, such as providing professional development or presenting at a conference. And 67% of the schools had disseminated best practices in multiple ways. There are currently 22 best practices shared on the NC Access website, and as of June this past year, there had been 437 views or downloads of those pages. Okay, we can move on to the next slide. So while the NC Access program provided fellows with readily applicable strategies, collaborative networks, funding, there are areas where improvements can be made, and Mr. Whalen's already discussed some of them. One of the key things that we suggested was getting more expert feedback from people that are already from schools that are participating in the program. So while NC Access fellows have commented on the usefulness and helpfulness of the presentations and the presenters, they also could benefit from mentoring and advice from current and former fellows. So for example, we use Sugar Creek as an example. It's a school that's been established for over 20 years. They've developed very comprehensive weighted lotteries, transportation, lunch, recruitment plans, community outreach, things like that. And their experience and expertise could really be leveraged in the years to come to serve as models and mentors for some of these newer schools that are opening either this year or have only opened in the past few years. Fellows also requested that the program include more follow-ups once they finish participating in the Fellows program. And that's not to say that the program isn't following up with them. This was from cohort 2 schools, but they definitely wanted to make sure that they were getting some help just to ensure that they're up to date with best practices, helping them troubleshoot any issues as they arise, and provide opportunities to gather additional feedback from the program. Fellows also found, did someone have a question? No, okay. Fellows also found that networking opportunities were one of the most valuable aspects of this program. Cohort 2 fellows felt that these opportunities, obviously would have been better if they were able to network in person, but because of COVID, it was just not possible. So in the future, they did express that they would like more time to focus on networking with other charter schools and would like to develop some sort of system for like a sustainable networking, opportunities to be put in place. So we also heard in open-ended interviews and on surveys that several schools noted that they would appreciate some differentiated fellow offerings. So for example, if schools that are in a planning and implementation stage might need some different feedback or presentations or support based on, versus schools that are expansion schools or schools that are currently open versus schools that plan to open in the future. And so maybe providing some opportunities to have that differentiated offerings for the professional development workshops would be helpful. Fellows also noted that the NC Access professional development workshops provided really valuable content. They felt it would be more helpful if some of that content was focused just for administrators. They found that some of it seemed to focus more on helping teachers develop those best strategies. And then the leadership we've noticed has also changed at several of the NC Access schools. And so some of the new leaders in their interviews suggested that it would be helpful if they could also participate in the upcoming fellows program, even if somebody from their school has already completed that program. Several schools were also not sure how or what would be used for school accountability purposes. And a system that clearly identifies what would be used to track progress towards performance goals that would help monitor them would be useful. And we've already discussed that that's something that the Friday Institute is going to work with the NC Access program to put something in place this fall. Fellows also would like to have better communication and transparency regarding program administration, especially when it comes to funding. A couple of schools that we talked to said that they were unsure how and when some of the funding would be distributed, although they did note that it's gotten a lot smoother over the past year. And also, several of the schools were concerned about sustaining their efforts to recruit and retain and support students once the grant funding is out. So now that we're in year 3, that's definitely something to start thinking about, is how do we work with these schools to help them plan to be able to sustain these efforts. And then a final note was some of the schools did run into issues providing transportation services in their community. This was especially difficult when they were trying to locate pickup and drop-off points. They noted that there was a lot of red tape involved with getting these spots approved. And it was suggested that if possible, I'm not sure if it is, that the NC Access program and the Office of Charter Schools work to establish some sort of state level network that could help provide assistance for these schools in identifying and approving pickup and drop off locations. And that pretty much concludes the evaluation portion. If we want, we can wait until the subgrantee spotlight to ask questions, or if anybody has questions now, they can ask them.
I think in the best interest of time, let's go ahead and move forward to the first presentation by Bradford Prep from Charlotte.
Great. Yeah, Kelly Painter, the principal from Bradford Preparatory School, is here to talk about some of the impacts of the program on her school.
Welcome.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate your time today. Excited to share a little bit about our school. So I'm Kelly Painter. I'm one of the co-founders of Bradford, and I'm currently the head of school. We are going into year 8, and we are finally full grown K-12 with 1,600 students. So this grant program has been a wonderful opportunity for us. This money and this program has allowed us to jump ahead and provide a lot of services a lot quicker than we had planned, being still a new school. We were excited that it was going to give us funds for curriculum and different supports, but one of our ultimate goals in the beginning was to really focus on our school environment and meeting the needs of our families. There seemed to be a lack of trust, which I think is probably common across charter schools, with the families and being very honest about their needs. And we really wanted to remove the barriers for our families so that we could get them in the door, have those relationships and trust, so that we could work with our families to make sure that all students were going to be successful. We did the weighted lottery for the first time this year, so we will just be seeing the success of that this coming year with our enrollment. But as part of that, we did a lot of marketing and recruiting. We are focusing on the economically disadvantaged and the ELL populations at our school. Over the 8 years of growing, we have naturally become very diverse in our student population, but those were 2 areas where we would definitely like to see an increase in the population. So those were 2 focus areas for us as a school. We really decided to look at the staffing. I just know that she just mentioned looking at when the program ends, how our school is going to sustain these programs. And so for us, it wasn't just the funds coming in and doing something right now for the next 5 years, but looking at the program as a whole and how are we going to sustain this long term. And so really making sure we had the staff to support the programs. So we were actually able to bring in some additional staff that were not funded with the money from the grant, but to support the grant programs. We actually added 2 staff members, one who was we called her a marketing specialist. That was really her ultimate goal, was to help us market and recruit for our weighted lottery. But she actually ended up doing much more. She speaks Spanish and was really able to reach out to our Hispanic community and try to connect with them and figure out how we could better support those students. In the meantime, that has helped us increase our EL population through the weighted lottery. So that was an amazing addition to our staff. We also added a family engagement coordinator. And that's really just kind of a fancy title for someone who can connect with our families. Again, our goal was we can get these students through the weighted lottery and marketing into the door, but how are we going to make sure that they are successful once they're there and that we can connect with families and keep them long-term, especially being a K-12 school. So our family engagement coordinator, her goal was to connect with all of our families that were on our economically disadvantaged list. So in the beginning of the year, I reached out to those families and let them know that obviously we keep their information confidential. With their permission, I would like to share their names with this person. All of them accepted. And so she communicated directly with these families about all of the services that we had to offer. And the great part about that was, as she was constantly communicating, different needs were coming up. We know transportation, we know lunch, but other needs would come up because she was able to have these direct conversations, things that we weren't even thinking about, that we were able then to create programs or support our families in a variety of ways. And so over this past year, we have seen a lot of trust gained in our program because of these two positions, that really, now that we have increased our enrollment for these two populations, I feel like we are in a better place to support those families because we have really worked on how to handle that and how to have those relationships in-house. We mostly used our funds for some curriculum instruction and materials. COVID obviously put a little kink in our plans. We were supposed to be doing a one-on-one tutoring program after school, and we're not able to do that because of COVID. So that will start this year. Obviously, we did some of the technology. So we went to one-to-one technology very quickly, which was a great thing for us to have. We also did start the transportation, and we actually are doubling the number of students that we are providing transportation for this school year. And every student that needs transportation has been able to get transportation. So we are very grateful for that. Another big piece for us was the lunch program. We always had a program in place, but it was not the best program. And so by reaching out to these families and getting feedback, we were able to create a better way for our families. So any family that needs lunch, they're able to get that very easily. We have a catered lunch program, so it's food that it's delivered to the school. We also were able to kind of branch out, provide some counseling and social work services to our families. We collaborated with a local organization in Charlotte that helps families with food on the weekends. And so we actually fundraise for canned food from our staff to provide to them. And then they provide groceries to our families every other weekend that go home with the students. And so that's also a great program. So again, I think one of the things that we really learned this year was by having a safe place for our families to communicate their needs, we were able to learn other ways that we could really support our families. And we all know that this directly impacts academics. If students do not have those basic needs met, they cannot get to school, they are not fed, they do not have their uniforms or school supplies, then we know they're not going to learn the way that we need them to. So we've really been able to break down those barriers, and I'm really looking forward to see the impact it's going to have this year now that those populations have really increased. The professional development was the last big piece that the grant provided this year, obviously with the Fellows program, which was an amazing program. We benefited very much from that professional development. We learned a ton. I feel like it was even more relevant during the pandemic because it hit on equity issues that really came to the surface even more last year during the COVID pandemic. But also we learned so much about the different types of professional development that were out there that you might not even think about. And because we learned about those, we were able to bring some of those to our school. We had some amazing professional development, and we look forward to doing more this year, especially with everyone being back in person a little bit more. Lastly, the weighted lottery, like I said, we just implemented that for the first time. And we actually went to an online enrollment system, which we have never used before. And we chose the one that Power School actually uses, dumps directly into Power School. And that gave us a very, a great and easy way to get the information. It was a very safe way, confidential. We knew it was going to be done correctly because it wasn't us just doing it in-house. And so it worked out really, really well. And that information got dumped in. And so we had about 12% of our new students fall into from the weighted lottery. Some of those fell into both categories, your economically disadvantaged and your ELL, and some were just one, mostly seeing the increase in our kindergarten class, since that's obviously where we have the most spots. So overall, it's been a great jumping in with this access grant. We look forward to being able to do more because of all that happened. And we were actually over enrolled last year, so we ended up doing very well financially with our budget. We were able to take a few steps ahead. So hopefully with approval from the access program, we will be able to do things like buy buses much sooner than we had planned and be able to really increase those services a lot sooner. But our families have been very open and willing to jump in, and it's been great to see the collaboration with everybody in the Bradford community.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for your time today. Anybody have a question for anything that happened this past year?
I have,
Dr.
I
Oxendine?
have a question.
Okay.
I probably have a lot of questions, but I'd have to get you on the sidelines to ask them. No, just comments. It sounds like you just went to the heart of relationship building. Getting hot and being visionary and planning ahead, knowing these funds are not going to last forever, thinking smartly and hiring from some other funding source, this person who worked closely with the families. So you've got, you really, I think you nailed it there. What would you talked about families. How many families are we talking about working closely with families?
So our economically disadvantaged last year was about 14%. And I would say about 220 students were on the list that were communicating consistently with those two positions. So I mean, it's a decent number of families, obviously a lot of siblings, so not as many parents, but you know, even though they might reach out, it was giving them one point of contact that they could trust. And even though their question might not be about lunch or busing, they could easily get to the information. And that was also very, very helpful. But immediately we saw an increase in them wanting to use all these services. Before, we've had the services and nobody would use it. So now I think the word has gotten out and we've had a much better way of, you know, communicating with them.
Just absolute trust building, wouldn't you say?
It definitely takes a lot of trust. And, you know, we wanted to break that down. We had families that thought that if they admitted that they were on the economically disadvantaged list, that we would kick them out. If, you know, they needed school supplies, that we would not keep them there. And all these myths that are out there that are not true. And myths or not, it's our job to break down those barriers with the community and with our own families to help them understand what we are there to do. And so it will take some time. Obviously, you're not going to have that change quickly, but this grant is just helping us kind of get 2 steps ahead. And then, like you said, it's our goal long-term to continue on with that.
Thank you very much. I'm inspired.
Thank you. Appreciate that.
Wonderful. Any further questions?
Thank
Well,
you.
thank you so much for your time today and for making the trip. So we have Guilford Prep also who is here. Mr. Whelan, would you like to make that introduction?
Benny Bradley and Robin Bateson from Guilford Prep.
Good afternoon. And thank you for your time today and the opportunity that we've been able to accomplish Voice of Color. So as we progress our presentation here.
So we missed your, will you please just share with us again, your name and, we had a little bit of audio difficulty on our end and hoping that we've worked out the kink on that. So could you begin again?
Okay, I'll jump in. Mr. Bradley is in Texas right now, so his connection may not be very good. Benny Bradley, he is our principal, and he was the one who was speaking. And I'm Robin Bateson. I'm the curriculum facilitator at Guilford Preparatory Academy. Mr. Bradley, can you hear me? Okay. I'm gonna move forward with the presentation, and he just informed me he got kicked out. So our focus using the access funding, we focused on improving the proficiency of our boys of color. When we looked at our data, one of the concerns that when Mr. Bradley first came to our school, he had noticed that our boys in the upper grades were not getting on the honor roll as frequently as the girls and compared to our younger students. And he wanted to delve into what the reason was for that and do something about that. If you could go to the next slide. Another concern that took us to the previous slide was our EOG data in 2018 and 2019. When looking at our data, we noticed in reading there was a 22-point gap in proficiency between our girls and our boys. We also noticed a gap within the math, 11.7 gap, as well as science. So that was alarming to us to look at it that way and see that they just weren't performing similarly to how our girls were performing, which led us to the initiatives, which were in the screen before. If you could go back to the third, right there we go. So our initiatives using the access funding, which we were so grateful to have received, was to focus on our boys. Our school is 83% African American with 10% Latino, and we wanted to focus on our boys because they were struggling, and it was evident in our honor roll assemblies, and it was evident in our EOG scores. So using that access funding, we were able to have staff trained through professional development. We began in the summer with Dr. Chance Lewis and engaging boys of color. Our teachers were trained over the summer. They participated in a virtual training. And once we went through that, we wanted to infiltrate that throughout our school. If you look on the left of our slide, you can see we added into our lesson plan template a strategy where the teachers were needed to include a strategy that would engage our boys. And we knew that would work with not only our boys, but our entire student body. And we started with those strategies that Dr. Chance Lewis had presented to us. So that was included in every single lesson across all content levels. To further that, we had an additional training by Robert Jackson, Becoming the Educator They Need. We purchased books using the access funding. We did a book study prior to him coming to train us, and he did 2 sessions virtually so we could increase our strategies and add those to our teaching expertise. As well as through weekly PLCs, we constantly addressed our boys. What can we do to help them? What strategies can we continue to add in there? And it has led us to decreasing the gap. Okay, yes, and so our results. So we, this year was very challenging when it came to COVID-19 and looking at our data, but we took our 2019 EOG data with those gaps and compared it to our benchmark that was similar to an EOG, and we noticed that the gap was closing. Our gap went down to a 9-point gap in reading. It went down to an 8-point gap in math, and we reversed the gap in science. I think a lot contributing to we did weekly experiments, which was part of one of the strategies, the hands-on strategies. And so our boys were ahead by 18 points according to our benchmark data. Looking at our EOG data, we did notice the gap is closing as well, and we are waiting on the reading data to hope to see the similar path for our students. Okay, unfortunately, Mr. Bradley, his connection was not good. I wish he could have been here, but does anyone have any questions?
Questions from colleagues? Thank you so much for sharing with us today. And we're all doing a round of applause for that science increase reversed, and now ahead by 18 points is really something that should be highlighted. And we'd love to hear more maybe about those experiments that you could share with your cohort so that other schools can experience that same tremendous gain. But thank you for your time today.
I don't mean to interrupt, but I will just add that one of the best practices on our website is part of embedding this strategy and sharing it more broadly. So the Guilford Preparatory Strategy is included into one of those implementation summaries, just as an example of things that go on our website.
We have one last school, correct?
Yes, and she will make it quick. Why don't you, Joy? Joy Warner and Connie Wessner are on the phone from Community School of Davidson.
Welcome.
Hi there. Can you all hear me?
We can.
Very good. Well, I appreciate you allowing us to be here with you, even though we're remote. So thank you so much. We'll go ahead and get going. My colleague here with me is Connie Wessner, and we are two of the leaders at Community School of Davidson. We're a K-12 charter school in Davidson, North Carolina, the northern tip of Mecklenburg County. And we serve last year about 1,426 K through 12 students. We've been in existence for about 20 years, and I'm the founder of the school. So thank you. To make our presentation kind of short and succinct, one of the niches that our school really created in the past 20 years is really focused on the notion of personalized learning, hands-on, active, brain-friendly, personalized learning. We all know that when students feel seen, heard, valued, and honored as humans, that they engage in their learning more actively. So in the last 2 years, kind of an additional step that we've kind of added to our school curriculum is something called the Empower Ed program. And the Empower Ed program is really an umbrella program that has different arms, and we will increase those arms and specialties as we continue through the future years. But the notion is that if students have voice and choice in their learning, that they're more actively engaged. So we created the Empower Ed program, and it is a multi-credited course that's integrated and multidiscipline, where teachers are working with cohorts of students for multiple years. We fashioned this after, if you're the Dennis Littke Big Picture Schools in Providence, Rhode Island. So this program allows students to work in a cohort with a smaller group with a teacher for a longer amount of time. Last year, we executed our first Empower Ed program, which was the Empower Ed Race program. And it was really a study of race and racism that was really student initiated. I think we can go to our next slide if that's okay. So students had identified a theme that they were particularly interested in. We were able to create 2 cohorts in the Empower Ed race social justice platform, and these students participated in that last year. The Empower Ed program, remember, is focusing on student voice and choice. So this coming year, in fact, next week, our teachers report will release phase 2 of our Empower Ed program, which is Empower Ed STEM, another student identified theme that they are interested and excited about having more time, more depth, and more intimate relationships. The beauty of our Empower Ed program, in addition to the small cohorts with the teachers, extended amount of time, multidisciplinary studies, is that it has a heavy influence from project-based learning and problem-based learning. So students are looking out into the world, identifying real-life challenges, problems, and then using their time in school to address those directly. I think we can go to the next slide. Sorry. Thank you. So here are just a few things that have happened at our school in the last couple of years that we wanted to highlight. In CSD, from the day we opened, we kind of developed a niche, because of our focus on personalized learning, we developed a niche around special education. And so we have students who are highly gifted coming to our schools, and students who have academic struggles, behavior struggles, developmental struggles. And that inclusive approach has been a real strength and a real niche of ours. When we look at our access grant, one of the challenges we had when we wrote our charter 20 years ago, we asked for an ability to do a race weighted lottery because we knew our location in northern Mecklenburg County, that our school probably wouldn't be as diverse culturally and racially and socioeconomically as we had hoped, but that was not allowed. So we were super excited about 6 years ago when the legislators allowed the weighted lottery for socioeconomic status. CSD started doing that immediately. Our board voted for an immediate weighted lottery. So this coming year will be our 6th year with a weighted lottery. But in the past 2 years, since we got our access grant, some of the work that we've been doing to both educate and meet expressed desires and interest in our school are some of the things you see on that timeline. We've done book studies around the Beverly Daniels Tatum book, Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria? We've done full staff professional development. We've really taken inclusiveness and otherness and taken a deep dive as a school to promote comfortable conversations that breed understanding and help heal divides in society. And so those are some of the activities that we've done to encourage critical and crucial conversations that build cohesiveness in our school community. As you'll see when you go down that continuum, this year for the 2021-2022, we'll roll out our Empower Ed STEM program, which is again multidisciplinary, multi-course credit cohort of kids doing problem-based learning around many different career paths in the STEM field. We know based on research, if students are passionate about what they're learning, they're engaged and the academic benefits are high. After the 2021-2022 school year, we look forward to rolling out some other Empower Ed programs. And we've really taken a hard look at the trades program and some performing art programs for future Empower Ed targeted areas. Connie, what have I forgotten?
I think maybe the only thing is to couch this in, where does this fit with our NC Access grant? It is that we are looking long-term as we bring kids in, as we welcome them as part of our school culture, to make sure that there is a culture in our school where everyone, as Joy said, can find a niche and no one feels like they've been recruited separately to our school to meet a particular demographic goal or enrollment goal. And that's why we're trying to look more broadly at how does our curriculum serve every kid that walks through the door.
Well, thank you both so much for sharing your approach to using the Access Fund. Board members, you've heard from 3 different schools who have taken an individualized approach and tried to meet the needs of their own communities. And it looks very different in 3 different geographic locations across our state. And so, Mr. Whalen, I want to thank you for your time, for the folks that you've coordinated with to provide us with the information. I did want to offer Mr. Machado offer an opportunity to offer one closing comment, and I am sensitive of the time on our agenda. So a closing comment from Mr. Machado on behalf of your team.
Thank you, Ms. White. I know we are running over. I want to read an email to you that I got from a school leader that is just now getting into the NC Access program to show you the kind of communication that we're having with the school and the feedback that we got back. But I got this just this week. It said, "Good morning, Dave. I hope all is well. I want to reach out to you and let you know you lit a fire under us after our call a month or so ago. We've been hard at work to make our school transportation program freely available to all our students, and we have close to 100 students already signed up. Last week, we purchased and brought home a small fleet of school buses and are ready for them once school starts. I appreciate your challenge to us to do better, and I hope we can rise up to that." email right here shows that this grant is working to change the landscape in the charter school community.
Thank you so much. Thank you to all of the presenters today. If you have any questions about this report, I encourage you to reach out to one of our leaders, and they'll be glad to answer any questions. Mr. Davis, I cede the microphone back to you.
Thank you, Ms. White. We'll now proceed to our last committee of the day, the Business Operations Committee, chaired by Vice Chair Duncan. Vice Chair Duncan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. On behalf of Todd Chastain, we lead the Business Operations Committee. And we once again have an exciting program of agenda items today, and I know everyone looks forward to this. Our first item is under new business, and we have school business modernization quarterly updates. And this, of course, is a very important effort that's presently underway. Dr. Mike Spano and Dr. Mark Sandberg are here to report on where we are, and welcome.
Thank you. And good afternoon, Chair Davis, Vice Chair Duncan, members of the board, Superintendent Truett, members and advisors of the board, Lieutenant Governor Robinson, Treasurer Falwell. I am pleased to stand before you today to provide you with an update on the Education Business Systems Modernization Initiative. Next slide. So I've been leading here at this department, this initiative for about 4 months. Prior to that, I was working on this for about 2 years at the Friday Institute in my role there. I'm excited about the progress that we made in the last year and excited to share this with you all today. So we've got where we are and then a preview, hopefully, of where we are going. So as you may know, the Business Systems Modernization Initiative began in 2016 with a directive for the state board to partner with the Friday Institute to create a plan to modernize DPI systems, including school business systems, the student information system, human resources, and others. The General Assembly continued this in 2017 in Session Law 2017-57 with a directive for DPI and the Friday Institute to execute the plan. And in this bill, the General Assembly announced their intent to fund a multi-year initiative to accomplish this goal. With budget issues surrounding the last biennium, there was limited funding made available for the budget. However, we're grateful for the funding that we've received, and we have been able to make great headway on multiple fronts. So the first thing that we need to do when we talk about modern is define what modern is, right? Modern is more than just shiny. It's not more than just moving away from the green screens. We still have plenty of green screen systems, but moving away from that does not necessarily make us modern. So when we talk about modern systems, we're talking about things that begin with the user in mind, things that are cloud-based, things that are secure by design, that can be expanded and extended, that improve our processes, right? Moving from a system that lets us do things on a green screen to doing the same things on a website are not necessarily modern systems. They are web-based versions of the same thing. So things that help us improve our process, get our data to the people who need it in real time, and improve our transparency. So when we talk about modern, it's these things that I want to keep in mind about why we are selecting what we are doing and how we are proceeding on these fronts. Next slide. So these are the areas that we're going to talk about today, where we've been working, and I'll go through a little bit of background and next steps on each of these. So AS400 is the old mainframe style server that drives a lot of our old applications, our homegrown HRMS application that's been in use since, I believe, 1986 and is still in use today, as well as the financial systems for about 3 dozen of our districts that are still 30 to 35 years old. The AS400 systems are old and they're complex, and because they don't run standard operating systems, most of our schools don't have the technical expertise to maintain these systems. In addition, as a part of Race to the Top, an effort was undertaken to move these systems out of the LEAs so that districts didn't have the burden of having to maintain those. The department did put out an RFP during Race to the Top. The cost was $1.4 million a year, and it was awarded to SAS. And SAS offers some features, cloud hosting these, that LEAs would not be able to have. For example, right, instead of one AS400, which was usually under the finance officer's desk, right, they have 2 redundant data centers one in Raleigh and one in Charlotte that allow for failover. There is real-time backups, which again, the LEAs, the backup system was traditionally whoever lived the furthest away took the backup tape home with them, right? That was our backup system. And we also have 24/7 monitoring and uptime monitoring, right? The intent is still to phase these systems out entirely, but we're not there yet, right? That's a goal that we're working towards as we modernize these systems. Right, so the student information system is where I've been spending most of my time on this project for the past few years. So the last RFP for a new student information system was actually done in 1997 when we transitioned away from SIMs to NCYs. Since then, a series of acquisitions and transitions moved us to our current SIS today. Because of the time that's elapsed between the RFPs, it was decided that it would be prudent to take stock of where we are and go back out to RFP in the last couple of years. In that process, we conducted extensive documentation of the use cases for the system, how people are using the SIS, and how those needs have changed over the last 2 decades. We also did a massive data collection. We spoke to 20,000 teachers and public school employees and DPI staff to help inform this RFP, a combination of 20,000 people through surveys and then 2,000 people in focus groups to help determine the needs for that RFP. The RFP was ultimately canceled due to lack of funding, but we do intend to issue that pending funding availability. However, that documentation of our business processes and the pain points provided the home base team, the data services team, guidance to streamline several of our processes and improve some of our current work. Dr. Wren and her team have been implementing a number of the items that were flagged as low-hanging fruit in the report that we are able to get with our current systems even before we go back out to RFP. So the BSM team also worked with the Center for Safe Schools to stand up the anonymous tip line. And Ms. Farley was up here a few months ago and indicating that the system had received about over 5,000 tips since it had gone online. In addition, we were able to get the Safer Schools grant stood up in about 6 weeks through the grants management system, which I'll talk about next. So last year in DPI, there were 3 major grant systems that were in use across the agency for different programs. The goal of the grants management project has been to consolidate all of these grant systems into a single tool. So LEAs and charter schools have one place to go for all of their grants and for all of their plans. In addition, this gives us the opportunity to develop some of our older custom in-house developed tools, focused again on procuring tools and customizing tools that meet our modern principles. We went with a system that was already in use by the Federal Programs Division, which is HMB grants, which we refer to in-house as CCIP, or the Comprehensive Continuous Improvement Planning System. In this project, we've expanded the use of that tool to over 50 grants across 7 divisions, managing billions of dollars of blocking competitive grants given to the districts, including all of the ESSER and the ESSER funding and Title I plans. We continue to grow this system to include additional grants in the system as we are able, including looking at pulling in other plans such as the AIG plan. To that end, you have an agenda item today, which for a contract amendment for HMB, which Mr. Duncan asked me to speak about during this presentation. Basically, the contract to date with HMB has been for a deliverables-based contract. Each grant or set of grants, we need to amend the contract. That worked well until the program expanded and now everybody wants to put their grants in there and we're having to constantly amend this contract. So instead of coming back to you every month with a contract amendment, what we're doing is looking to switch and asking the board to allow us to switch that from a deliverables-based contract to pre-purchasing or pre-allocating a bucket of hours that we can use to expand the system and purchase new grants. That gives us the flexibility to continue to expand and include grants in the system and also take some work off of the DPI staff, because right now these grants are all on one contract and Dr. Townsend, as the business owner for that, her team has to manually go through and look at the charges and figure out percentages of the invoices for which grants apply to which division, and then work with finance to make sure that that gets charged out correctly. So it will simplify a lot of work for both her team and for the finance team. It'll give the divisions a little bit more flexibility. We have worked with the BSM team and IT Business Relationship Management Group to form a governance committee that will help onboard new divisions so we can manage the growth of this system effectively and manage the contract and build some shared ownership of this system. While the amount in the contract is high, so I don't blame you for a little sticker shock, it was selected to be a number that we would never reach, right? We wanted to make sure that we picked a number high enough that I don't have to come back to you and amend the contract again. So during the life of this contract, we wanted to make sure that we built a number that was high enough that we would be able to accommodate the system.
Best
and all of our
expressed
needs.
is within that limit, we're only paying for what we're using.
Yes, sir. All right, so next up, so back in the day, some of you may remember the old school jobs website that DPI used to have where it would aggregate school job postings from across the state. As technology changed, fewer and fewer districts were using HRMS for their job postings, so that website eventually was less useful. However, the need to aggregate job postings, that's a huge recruiting tool for districts to be able to see not only the jobs in one county, but in the neighboring counties as well. So that remained a need. So the statewide job board went online in 2019 as a partnership with Best NC and Teach.org. The job board is powered by SchoolSpring, which is a PowerSchool product that aggregates postings from across the state from every LEA and charter school, regardless of what applicant tracking system they're using locally. At this point, job postings for all PSUs are represented in the system and they're discoverable by region, by category, or by keyword. Best NC has been a fantastic partner in this work, and the Senate budget also has provisions to continue the work. So the applicant tracking. So while SchoolSpring will aggregate from any applicant tracking system, we did want to have a default system available. So we did an RFP for this service in 2019. Which is a service called Teacher Match, which has been acquired multiple times and is now a PowerSchool product. This is the default choice for districts. Districts can choose this, districts and charters, and 283 of them do, right? But the other ones use other things that they would rather use, and that's okay, right? This is the default choice that we've made available to districts and charters free. And if there's something else that they would rather use, they're welcome to do that. So for that, since PowerSchool's acquisition, they are transitioning to move SchoolSpring and IntelliGlance into a new product called Unified Talent. And that's what we'll be working on this year, is combining those services. So now the big item, which is the ERP. ERP stands for Enterprise Resource Planning. That is our HR and financial systems. So the goal of this project is to update the outdated financial and HR systems in the district. Right, as I mentioned, about 2/3 of the districts are using an HR system that's almost 40 years old. About 24 of the LEAs are using a financial system that is over 30 years old. So the goal of this modernization is to remove from these systems, and an RFP was conducted in 2018 and awarded to Tyler Technologies for their Munis platform and Cherry Road Technologies to integrate Oracle Cloud. It's an important note on these contracts is they are opt-in, right? So districts can choose to buy off of these contracts, or they can choose to be funded through school business systems modernization on these contracts, but they can also choose to modernize with their current provider. We don't, however, because we don't have RFP for that, when we fund this centrally, we are only funding the districts who are moving to one of the two vendors on the RFP. Our approach to working with those two vendors is to create what we call a golden template. The idea is that if we do the integrations with the state once and we get it right and we come up with our business rules, then we can copy and paste to the other districts. And DPI team provides support for logistics, for project management, and then support for those statewide integrations. While the lack of the biennium budget and the last biennium has slowed the project, we continue to move along. We have about 6 pilots in flight. And next slide. We have our first 2 pilots that go live. They went live July 1st. So Gaston County Schools went live with Cherry Road. And New Hanover County Schools went live with the Tyler Technology product. And the important thing, they got paychecks out on July 31st, right? So that's the thing, when you go live with a new financial system, you can mess anything up as long as people get paid. And everybody got paid, and I am told that the state reporting to Ms. Strauss's team that for these two districts for their July reports is nearly finished as well. So we have a couple of districts that are up next. So Union is in their go live process right now. Swain and Craven next month. Charlotte, Triangle Math and Science Academy in Macon County in October. And then our next ones are Cumberland and Guilford in January. All of these are pilots with exception of Triangle Math and Science Academy, Cumberland and Guilford. And they actually chose, instead of waiting for the budget to be able to fund their work, they were ready and they actually self-funded their work to move forward.
To stop there, that's going to be an issue.
Yes, sir.
Just to highlight for everyone, I think those PSUs anticipate, because they weren't online to get it, they felt they needed to move forward. They will ask to get funded after they've implemented the system and paid for it, and it's not clear that will be funded or not.
Right.
But it is clear it will be an issue.
Right. So they have accepted that risk of they may not be able to get funded. However, I've had conversations with the legislative team about seeing if it's possible. Right. We're not 100% convinced what's possible and what's not now. We're still trying to figure all of that out. So to summarize, next slide. These are the next steps in the process. So this year, we're still going to continue with the AS400 migration and phase out, migrate from the retiring IntelliGlance platform to PowerSchool's new applicant tracking system, streamline the grants process, and then for the ERP system, next slide. The Friday Institute is still under contract, so they're going to help us with a program evaluation of these first go lives to help determine what the efficiencies that we've been able to leverage as well as the challenges that we've had. And we are grateful for the Senate support. So the Senate budget proposal allocates nearly $90 million to advance the modernization initiative. So we are looking forward to seeing the House budget and the final budget to see how much of these district migrations we're going to be able to fund. So that is our next step, is to work with LEAs to determine what each LEA wants to do. And then once we know what LEAs want to do and how much funding we have, we can start to get things in line and line up, working with the vendors and the LEAs to get contracts signed and then to allocate funding as we have it available. And then to continue to phase out the old HR and financial systems over time. So, future projects. We are working with Dr. Tomberlin's team on a new licensure RFP that's currently in the field. We also have several RFPs in the planning stages. Pending ratification of the budget, we're going to start working with Ms. Schaus and her team in order to begin a parallel modernization effort for DPI as an agency, migrating our own 40-year-old mainframe systems to the modern Oracle system that is being used by the state, and then determining what that integration between DPI and the PSUs will look like. We're also looking at agency process modernization, how we are handling our own workflows internally and how we can automate some of our workflows and our approval processes. So with that, Mr. Duncan, I'll turn it back to you.
Thank you very much for the report and the work that you're doing. Are there questions or comments by board members?
I have a quick question.
Please,
Mr.
Dr.
Duncan,
Austin.
thank you so much for this really good presentation. I'm trying to formulate the right question, so bear with me. This was a lot to process. You said just a few minutes ago, you're waiting on school districts to inform the department of what they need or what they desire. So are there some basic common functions that all 15 districts and charters need?
So
Charters part of this.
So charters right now we're not included in the initial plan, but that is, we are looking at charters. So there are three options that an LEA has. they can go with one of the two vendors. So that's two of the options. And they can also stay with the system that they have and modernize to that system's web-based solution, right? And that's going to, the path that they're going to choose is going to largely depend based on the district, right? Their capacity, their interest in moving away from what they currently have, their ability to execute this, which is a bear of a project to take on. And then between the two vendors on the ERP, they're going to have to evaluate them and decide which one they like better. So we're asking LEAs to take on that process and figure out, one, if they're going to move, and then if they choose to move, which of the two vendors that they are going to move to. And there's cost differences depending on how they choose. Obviously, if they stay where they are, we don't right now have to have any financial obligation centrally for that. But if they choose one of the two new vendors, there is cost differentials and needs that are different based on those.
And I would add on to that we started the triangle math and sciences pilot with the charter schools, knowing we'd have to engage charters down the road. They were brave enough to step up and do the work. So we started charters, going well. So I just wanted to add that.
Okay, thank you. Thanks.
Yes, any other questions or comments? All right, not hearing anything. Thank you very much, Dr. Spano, Dr. Sandberg. Thank you very much for the report and for the work that's going into this. Our next piece of new business is the American Rescue Plan update, better known as ESSER 3 funding, will become the main focus of this discussion, and the planning for the use of those funds. Dr. Maher is here to lead us in that. Welcome.
Good afternoon, Chair Davis, Vice Chair Duncan, Superintendent Truett, and members of the board. Thank you for having me back again for my monthly update on the U.S. Department of Ed ARP plan. So this work, of course, is done between myself and Dr. Townsend. And so today I'll provide you an update on what's happened over the last couple of weeks with our plan. Okay, so just a quick overview. I'll review what the ARP plan actually is, make sure everybody's on the same page. Then go through kind of a timeline of events for the last roughly month. We'll talk about some of the initial revisions that we made based on our plan, then some additional clarifications that were requested by the Department of Education, and then we'll go through some next steps and then some concerns that we have from the department side. Okay. So the ARP plan, if you remember, it is the template that we complete for the U.S. Department of Education so that we can receive our full ESSER 3 funding. So we have currently received 2/3 of those funds. We are awaiting the final 1/3 pending the approval of our plan by the Department of Ed. The template has a few very specific components. So it asks for the initial response to the COVID pandemic, how we coordinated our ESSER 1, ESSER 2, and GEAR funding, a broad plan for our use of ESSER 3 under the allowable categories, and it includes 7 sections to cover those pieces, and you can see those there. We submitted a plan to the board back on June 17th. That plan was approved. We posted it for a 30-day comment period, received that feedback, which we shared with the board, and then submitted the initial draft to the U.S. Department of Education on June 21st, 2021. And that was, I believe, approximately 14 days after our initial deadline. We asked for an extension so that we could fulfill the 30-day comment period. Okay, so you'll see June 17th, the plan was approved. The 22nd, Federal Program Monitoring, Dr. Townsend submitted that plan to the Department of Ed. We received our first round of feedback on July 9th, where the U.S. Department of Education requested 10 items for revision, which I will get to in just a moment. On July 16th, Office of Learning Recovery and Federal Program Management Monitoring submitted revisions to the Department of Ed. Those revisions were clarifications based on things that we had already had approved by the board in our initial document. So we just provided more detail around some of the either categories or made clarifications. And then finally, on July 22nd, the U.S. Department of Education requested further clarification on 2 items. I'll talk about those. And then most recently, we had a conversation. I wasn't able to update the PowerPoint, but we had a conversation with U.S. Department of Education last week just to get some clarification on the components that were missing. And I'll talk a little bit more about our conversation with Department of Ed towards the end. So in our is there some? Okay. So within the initial revisions, there were 10 specific things that fell under 3 categories that were asked for by the Department of Ed. They wanted the inclusion of some full documents rather than links. So we used links, for example, to the Strong Schools Toolkit, and they actually wanted the full document. So we supplied them with the full document. They wanted the full document for Lighting Our Way Forward, which was for remote learning and so on. So we provided those documents to them. They wanted an additional narrative response on priorities based on student subgroups and how we were going to hold LEAs accountable for adhering to the law. So we clarified how the application that LEAs submitted to the department complied with the component of accountability. And then we went through the subgroups for each of the identified groups and then talked about the impact, the current best data available on the impact on each of those subgroups, and then how that rolled out into a priority for us. And then they wanted further consultation on our plan to ensure that reserved funds are actually used for students for whom there was a disproportionate impact based on the COVID pandemic. And then, and so that the reference there is the U.S. Department of Education email to Dr. Townsend, and that's in your materials. So like I said, we made those initial revisions. Those are the documents that were submitted. We provided additional metrics and then clarification. And then you'll notice we were, I guess, the way the U.S. Department of Education expressed it to us was that there was some problematic language in terms of how we were going to allocate funds. So what we had talked about in terms of the allocation of funding was we used what the General Assembly, the language the General Assembly had used for ESSER 2 was that funds were essentially allocated based on the existing expenditure of federal funds. And we were told that essentially that didn't comply with the spirit of the law, that the law intends us to target these resources towards those students who are most disproportionately impacted. And so we eliminated that and alerted Mr. Falkenberry and Mr. McKinney so that they could alert members of the General Assembly who still have not yet appropriated our ESSER 3 funds, that if they included this type of language in ESSER 3, it was going to present problems for us down the line once we do have our funds appropriated. And so you can see that the second document there is USED revision on 7/16. Then the follow-up response from the Department of Ed, as I mentioned, they accepted 8 of our 10 revisions. They asked for additional feedback on 2 items. They wanted additional consultation with some specific subgroups. And so you'll see there that includes students, civil rights organizations, unions, children with disabilities, English learners, homeless children, children in foster care, migratory children, incarcerated children, and other underserved students. So, Dr. Townsend and I have embarked on a plan to meet with each of those identified groups. She's taken on 10 of those groups. I have 2 because they fall under the federal program office. I'm taking on 2 of those groups, so I'm meeting with students. That meeting will occur on Friday afternoon. I also met with NCAE, and that meeting occurred yesterday. And so we're taking that in. And then Dr. Townsend let me know that she has met with all of those groups with the exception of 3, NAACP, exceptional children, and English language learners. But she does have a timeline and a plan in place to meet with those groups as soon as possible, hopefully within the next week. And then lastly, we needed to provide a description that addressed a very specific element, and it was a deadline, which is September 30th, and so that was submitted back. And so that's the deadline by which a PSU must apply for its funds. And so they wanted a date. We gave them a time frame, but they wanted a date. Okay. So as I mentioned, Dr. Townsend and I are meeting with stakeholder groups directly. We're also working on a long-term plan for continued consultation and feedback. We'll revise the plan and submit it back to the Department of Ed. And after our phone call, so we talked with Department of Ed directly, And just so you're aware, I am tracking state plans. Only 17 states are currently approved by the Department of Ed. So we are not an outlier here in the country. Only 42 states have actually submitted plans to this point. So there are several, 8 states that are well behind in their requirement to submit their plan. Several states have been approved with conditions. North Carolina is likely going to be a state that is approved with conditions. The condition that we were made aware of is that we will be required to update our plan as we develop new funded programs, which we fully anticipated from the start. I think I mentioned that back in June when we first started talking about this. So that's nothing that's out of the ordinary for us. We are one of only a few states that has their funding appropriated by a General Assembly, which adds a little bit of complication to the whole matter, which is one of the reasons we're going to be required to continually update our plan with the Department of Ed. Right, so some concerns from the agency's perspective. The delay in ESSER 3 has presented some significant challenges in the development of a comprehensive recovery plan. It is really hard to think about how we provide wraparound supports and services and programs in a comprehensive manner that are built upon best available data and programs that we are already delivering without having a sense of what the larger pool of funding is going to be. This lack of comprehensive plan means we cannot engage with stakeholders in a meaningful way. It is hard for me to sit down with a group and talk about how we're going to spend ESSER money if I don't know how much ESSER money we actually have to spend and the kinds of programs we want to target. And then finally, the lack of control over the appropriation could certainly result in proposals not being part of a larger pandemic recovery plan. It could also result in appropriations that are not consistent with federal law. And if that happens, then the state will be required to pay those funds back with state dollars. And so I've expressed those concerns certainly to the superintendent and to our legislative directors. I believe that is all for me, but I'm happy to answer questions and provide additional feedback.
Thank you for the update. Let's see one question. All right, Dr. Oxenden.
I do. I have a couple of questions. Thank you.
Ma'am.
I'm a little bit confused, and I know you're going to help me become unconfused about the quagmire with the General Assembly. It sounds like the language in the statute is a barrier. Is that correct?
It can be. So when they appropriated ESSER 2, we have 2 PRCs in particular that have that same language. And so I'm working with Ms. Schaus and others to ensure that we can deliver those funds to programs in a meaningful way. ESSER 2 and ESSER 3 are different programs. They were put in place by different administrations. So we have to think of those separately, but we did send that language that was used in ESSER 2 back to the Department of Education as part of our plan. And they told us that we could not use that as a way in which to fund programs. It did not ensure that we were targeting funds to disproportionately impacted students.
So that seems to be the concern of Washington.
Yes.
The greatest, the target group that is being impacted.
Yes. If you read the template and you kind of look at the updates as they've come out, and I've listened to Secretary Cardona talk, the U.S. Department of Education right now is very interested in or really kind of pushing in-person instruction. If you read that plan, it talks a lot about what we are doing as a state to ensuring we are putting children back in in-person instruction in schools. And it is very concerned about students who have been disproportionately impacted and targeting our funds to disproportionate impact.
It seems like this would be, to me, just listening to your presentation, I don't know all the ins and outs of the mechanisms, but it seems like I just can't imagine. Are you going to interview these stakeholder groups? I saw incarcerated youth.
Mm-hmm.
So
it's not the youth themselves. It is their advocates.
The agency?
Yes.
The agency?
Yes.
Or advocates?
Yes. So it's essentially advocates for those student groups.
Good. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there other questions or comments? All right, not hearing any. Thank you, Dr. Maher, and thank you
Sir.
very much to your team. You may want to make one further thought about the status of where ESSER II funds remain at this point.
So as far, are you talking about from the PSU level or the agency?
Agency level.
So for my office, we've got two PRCs that we are working on. That's the $40 million appropriation and the $26 million that are geared towards summer programs. And I actually have a proposal that we've built out that is actually making its way through regional directors and others inside the agency now before I get it to the board to review, so that I want to have it fully vetted before I bring anything before you. So we have that, and then we have some unreserved funds still available for programs. And I have a meeting coming up. I'm scheduling a meeting with the deputies to talk about perhaps how we target some of those funds towards Operation Polaris, and again, kind of targeting some of these high need areas and things.
Thank you. I know this program was on, this presentation was on ESSER III, but I want to remind everybody, as you just did very effectively, we have ESSER II funds that are still requiring good oversight.
And to be honest, with the 40 and the 26, I know there's been some push to really try to allocate those funds. They are targeted towards summer learning, and I wanted to wait until we started to get some data back on the school extension program, which we have. I held a meeting with 15 districts a couple of weeks ago to talk about summer bridge programs that they ran and how that might be an opportunity for us going forward. So we're trying to learn from what we had this summer to build out something for the next 3 summers, so that it's not a standalone program, but rather part of a comprehensive plan.
And that's a good segue into what we need to hear about next month as you now garner the data. I think it's going to be real important for the board to get a pretty detailed report on what we saw and what we've experienced and your evaluations thereof.
Yes, sir. We'll have it.
Very good.
See you next month.
We'll see.
Thank you.
Thank you. Appreciate your work and that of your colleagues. All right, we're now on Biz Op 1. We've made it to our first action item. And if Kevin Harrison is here, he doesn't, I think he knows this, but in a minute or less, there's one contract that's here, actually 2 contracts, but they're for the same thing. And so you have less than a minute. The clock starts now.
Less than a minute. Okay, these are 2 contracts for a total of 9 school buses across 7 districts. Back a number of years ago, the General Assembly set forth a minimum number of miles those school buses had to make, and these are some really, really old ones. These are 1996s and 1997s. The standard replacement age this year at 20 years would be, we'd be anticipating the 2002s to go this year, so these are really old. They have tried. They were a little behind. But we're trying to get them out of that situation. These vehicles are difficult to obtain parts for anymore and keep in good condition. So we're helping out on that by getting rid of these 9 vehicles across these 2 contracts. This is not related to prior contracts that we might have talked about related to Volkswagen settlement funding or anything else. And this is not our primary order for the school year, which is done through the school districts. This is just something extra that we're doing with receipt-generated funds from the sale of old school buses. And it impacts Buncombe, Carteret, Gaston, Chowan, Davie, Lee, and Robeson counties. Thank you.
And it really are needed, obviously, buses, but it is outside our normal program is what we wanted to highlight. You will be back. Biz Op 2, 21st Century Community Learning Center, the grant recommendations. Dr. Latricia Townsend is here to provide us with that update.
Good afternoon, everyone. I am elated to come before you to present recommendations for our Cohort 15 21st Century Grant Competition. So the purpose of these funds is really to assist students in the after school time period. I would really say out of school time. So after school programming as well as summer programming. Although many of our programs really supported students last year during the pandemic, we were operating under a waiver from USCD, which enabled these programs to operate during school hours to really support remote learning. These funds are actually authorized under the Every Student Succeeds Act. Title IV, Part B. And these funds are different from most of the funds that we manage. Most of the funds that we manage go directly to PSUs. These funds actually open us up a little bit and enables us to actually provide funding for community-based organizations, city or county government agencies, IHEs, faith-based organizations, or even for-profit corporations. So we have a wide variety that is really coming together to really support the needs of students in this out-of-school time period. Now, for our application process, we go through 3 basic levels. In the first level, we actually utilize SERVE at the University of North Carolina at Greensboro. They serve as our external partners. They help us hire a group of reviewers. And so for each application that is submitted, it actually has a review by 3 individuals, and the score is at some point averaged. If there is a point where there is too much variance between those scores, a 4th reviewer will come in. We just really want to make sure in this process that things are done in a fair manner. In the second level of review, that would be my staff and myself, we are able to add a series of priority points based on the number of students that are being served in rural areas or high poverty areas. In this competition, you could get up to 5 priority points. And then the last level is what brings me here today. We are presenting the actual entities for your funding approval. So I want to talk a little bit about quality bands. When we think about the grant applications that are submitted, we really want to make sure that people that are receiving this 21st century funding, that they will be able to put on a program that is going to meet the needs of students. And so for that reason alone, we only are able to fund applications that fall within the excellent, strong, or average quality bands. If it's below that, we're not able to do it. I also need to tell you a little bit about how we shifted to a regional model. I got a lot of feedback from Vice Chair Duncan about really making sure that we are providing funds across the entire state. So with the regional approach, we opted to fund 3 programs per region if possible. And then we used a rank order system to actually to select the others. And that's going to be an important point when we move into the next slide. So you will see that we have representation across each of the regions. We have come before you with other grant competitions in which we were not able to say that we had a good regional distribution. Again, we tried to fund 3 applications at a minimum per region. I will say that one of the applications that was submitted from the Northwest did not fall in the appropriate quality bands. And as a result, we were not able to fund that particular application. And so if you move to the next slide, you will see that the funding recommendations range from about 660,000 for the Northwest to a high of 4.4 million in the Southwest. But again, we have distribution across all of the educational regions. And then the next 3 slides actually just list out, and I will not read all 61 of them, but we have 61 funding applications that we are recommending to you at this point for a grand total of about $21 million. On a typical year, we get about $35 million that we would actually send out through this particular program. We do operate on a cohort model, so we do need to reserve some of that to be able to fund the past cohorts. That concludes my presentation, and I will entertain any questions as necessary.
Very good. Are there questions or comments on this? Ms. Cammon?
I just would like to notify you and the chair that I will need to recuse myself from this item when we vote tomorrow.
Let the record reflect that Ms. Kamnitz has recused herself from BizOp 2.
Thank you. Any other questions or comments? Well, Dr. Townsend, let me thank you for you and your staff for working through this and commend you for the strong efforts that you're making to make sure in this grant process that all parts of the state are represented and participatory in it, and the thoroughness and detail you've provided to it. We're all very grateful for that.
Thank you, Vice Chair Duncan.
Our next item for on first reading is Op 3, which again refers to ESSER 2 funds. This is the ESSER 2 Leadership Funds request for the Governor's School. Alexis Schaus will lead us in this item. Welcome.
Welcome. Good afternoon. This item is requesting on action on first read the use of undesignated ESSER 2 funds for the Governor's School to cover cost of testing and cleaning at the school during this past summer. And just as a informational note, the Governor's School does operate the 2 summer programs on the 2 campuses of close to about 700 students, and they have just finished their session. They had no positive COVID cases during that time. And the Division of Advanced Learning and Gifted Education, which manages the Governor's School, they did work very closely in collaboration with our partners at DHHS and other areas to provide a mitigation plan for COVID. And they also received a lot of kind of at no cost items to support that plan. Those items included PPE that valued over $100,000 from emergency services, 800 sets of masks from the governor's office and DHHS, and hundreds of rapid COVID-19 tests through the DHHS testing program. So this obviously offset a lot of the costs of that program during this past summer. As I stated, as a result, they had no positive COVID tests. However, there were additional actual costs incurred. So the department is just asking for $35,000 from the ESSER 2 undesignated funds to cover the cost for the PCR tests, which cannot be received at no cost. Those were provided to the unvaccinated students and staff. They also had costs for healthcare staff costs and some cleaning costs.
Of course, the key question is, do these funds meet the definition under the statute for being appropriate under COVID-19 recovery funds?
Yes, sir, they do.
Other questions or comments? All right, not hearing any. Thank you very much. Our next item is BizOp. Let's see. BizOp 4, which is the American Rescue Plan, back to ESSER 3 funds, but this is for grant programs, the allotment policy. And John Kiefer will make sense of 90 pages of materials that are complicated as the dickens to the normal person. He's going to do it in a mere matter of moments.
Good afternoon. So as noted, today we bring forward for consideration the allotment policies for the American Rescue Plan IDEA grant programs. And to help for consideration of those policies, we did want to provide an overview of the ARP IDEA grants, what they are and how they're required to be distributed by the federal government. So within the American Rescue Plan Act, Congress appropriated over $2.5 billion for additional IDEA Section 611 grants. Those are grants that serve students with disabilities ages 3 through 21. And $200 million for additional IDEA Section 619 preschool grants, which serve children with disabilities aged 3 through 5. From that fund, North Carolina has already received grant awards totaling over $81 million for the 611 portion and over $6 million for the 619 portion. I do want to emphasize that these funds are in addition to our previously appropriated IDEA funds. There was no reduction or offsetting. These aren't a segregation of funds for a specific purpose. These are purely additional grant funds available for services for this population of students. These are unique and separate grant programs. They have their own CFDA number, and we have to account for them separately. But perhaps a little unusually, they are subject to all of the IDEA grant requirements and have to be distributed in conjunction with the standard IDEA funds. So while they're separate grant programs, they don't have separate grant requirements. They are for all other intents and purposes, normal IDEA funds. One of the things we wanted to highlight related to these funds is that these are not the only funding related to the coronavirus relief efforts from the federal government that the state of North Carolina and the PSUs within the state will be receiving to provide services to students with disabilities. The General Assembly did appropriate funding out of the Coronavirus Relief Fund for services for exceptional children, and the state board did include exceptional children grants within its budget for the ESSER 1 10% set aside. However, this is the largest investment to date for services for these students, and it will bring the total provided at this point up to almost $135 million. Although we would point out that these are just the funds that were provided specifically for this purpose. Services for students with disabilities is an allowable use for several other grant programs, including the ESSER funds. So at the end of all of this, whenever that might be, actual spending on these students could far exceed that $135 million. These are just funds that have a restricted target population of those students. So did want to make that clear and emphasize that point. When looking at our total FY22 IDEA picture, you can see that the ARP IDEA funds are a very meaningful increase in our IDEA awards. The 611 bucket is about a 22% increase over our standard award, whereas the 619 is actually greater than 50% increase in our standard IDEA 619 award. Both of these new grants do have the same period of availability as their standard IDEA counterparts, so they do expire in September 30, 2023. So there will be kind of a need for PSUs to ensure that they account for this additional funding and expend those funds in a timely manner to avoid, the return of any funds at the end of the period. Okay. As noted, these funds are to be allotted per federal guidance in conjunction with the standard IDEA funds. And so we did want to provide a brief overview of the IDEA funding methodology. This looks very simple. It's in reality a little bit more complicated, but we wanted to kind of try to stay high level. And so there's two components to the IDEA funding methodology, a base allotment and what we call the remainder. And so for the base, each eligible public school unit is to receive an amount equal to a proportionate share of 75% of the state's IDEA awards from either fiscal year 2000 for the 611 grants or fiscal year 1998 for the preschool grants. Once the base allotments are determined, and there are some adjustments, there are some criteria for adjusting those amounts year to year. The remaining funds, so after we take the total of the base amounts, the remaining funds, whatever that is within the budget for IDEA for that year, is distributed by a formula that distributes the funds 85% according to population and 15% according to the relative numbers of low income students within each PSU. Next slide. So when thinking about how this plays out with two different grant programs and one grant calculation, what the need to do from a school business perspective, we will take the standard IDEA state aid budgets and combine those with the ARP IDEA state aid budgets for the respective programs to come up with a new kind of total section 611, 619 state aid amount. Which will then be used to go through the formula just outlined with the base and the remainder. Because the base is not dependent on the total amount of funding in any given year, it's independent of that. I think it's reasonable to assume that the majority of the ARP IDEA funds will go out through what we would call the remainder. But we haven't actually done the calculation, so I didn't want to provide a specific breakdown at this point around the percentage of the various funds that would go out through the base and the remainder amounts. And then on the back end, school business will have to do an apportionment for each PSU between the various PRCs based on the relative percentage of the state aid budget total. Slide. And then the
Just
final.
hold on that one for 1 second. That highlights how difficult that's going to be audited at the end of the day. And that highlights how difficult and how intense the administration over these funds has to be, if you can begin to imagine trying to keep track of these funds. So thank you for that illustration, John. It's very helpful in that regard.
We certainly take our responsibility for internal controls and the calculation process very seriously. And we'll do our utmost to ensure accuracy in these calculations. Final point. Our third PRC that we're providing is the PRC for ARP IDEA Coordinated Early Intervention Services, or CEIS. CEIS are exactly what they say they are, early intervention services. They're services for students who are not yet identified as needing special education services, but who do need additional academic or behavioral supports to succeed in a general education environment. So trying to get involved before the elevated services are required potentially. Under the IDEA, a public school unit that has been identified by the state as having a significant disproportionality based on race and ethnicity with respect to identification, placement, and discipline of students must set aside 15% of its IDA allotment for CEIS. The statute also allows what we call permissive CEIS. So any school district can elect to set aside 15% of their funds, but the ones who have been identified as having a significant disproportionality are required to do so. We use here at DPI, we use a holding PRC for CEIS for the standard IDA funds. It has a restricted chart of accounts, and it's a very useful tool to ensure that PSUs who are required to set aside 15% do actually use those funds solely for CEIS. It helps us with our oversight, and it helps the PSUs from a budgeting and financial management standpoint to ensure compliance with that specific requirement. Because the same requirements apply to ARP IDEA funds, we do have to set up a corresponding holding PRC for those funds for the ARP IDEA grants, because the same 15% of those funds would have to be set aside within that PRC. That's it. I do have a question. It's like good.
Questions or comments on this? I think I understood about 70% about it, and I feel really good about that.
Mission accomplished.
John, thank you, because this is really complex, and I appreciate the report, and you shed some real insight about the great work that's going on behind the scenes by our various business operation leaders in different departments to keep us going forward through this. Any questions, comments beyond that? All right.
Great. Thank you very much.
That brings us into Biz Op 5, and now we're going to jump back to ESSER 2 funds. This is a request to use unallotted ESSER 2 funds to support work that supports Leandro and strategic priorities and efforts related to COVID-19 recovery. Dr. Townsend Smith is going to present this item. Welcome. Like
Thank
you've
you.
not been here all day.
Chair Davis, Vice Chair Duncan, Superintendent Truett, Lieutenant Governor Robinson, Treasurer Falwell. Here before you today to present, I'll be up here to present Biz Op 5 and Biz Op 6, so Vice Chair Duncan won't have to call on me twice. So as a reminder, last year, this board allocated COVID dollars to support district and regional support, specifically related to its Leandro priorities, which are folded into strategic plan commitments and to the superintendent's plan as we move forward with Operation Polaris. Specifically, due to COVID, there is a need to do a deeper dive into the impact on districts most affected or impacted by the virus. And we know that many of our Leandro districts were impacted significantly. And furthermore, the U.S. Department of Ed has placed an emphasis on making data publicly available and detailed. And currently we have a process underway where we're building out a dashboard to respond to Leandro, et cetera. So through partnership with the agency and the board, we are seeking an appropriation from the 600 million that has been unallocated of approximately $450,000 to fund salary for staff, specifically to help to ensure that we are monitoring trends, providing additional administration, implementation support, project management, research and evaluation together with the superintendent's team to ensure that components are aligned across the strategic plan, Leandro, Operation Polaris, and COVID-19 efforts. We want to partner with Harvard through a fellowship to build internal capacity and support in response to COVID-19, and then just continue the further development of the dashboard work, much to your charge that you gave us several months back, to make sure that as we are developing data analytics, et cetera, that we have a concerted effort across that work. And so this is a funding request on your behalf to address those efforts directly related to COVID-19. Are there any questions?
Questions, comments? All right, and you answered the first key question, which is it COVID-19 related? The second key question is, will this be done in coordination? It's done in your position with State Board. Is it done in coordination with the department, which I also think you've answered in your presentation?
I think that's a critical part of this work, Vice Chair Duncan. And at the heart of this request is that continued teamwork, collaboration, coordination of efforts for sure. Yes, sir.
Very good. Any other questions or comments? All right, not hearing any, why don't you keep going on Biz Op 6?
Yes, sir.
Thank
Yes, sir. The second request before you today is a request from NC Ed Corps. As a reminder, the state board approved the use of its NC Education Fund for Ed Corps specifically for COVID-19. As a result of those efforts, we were able to raise a significant amount of money specifically for Education Corps. As a reminder, we did Ed Corps did submit a request to withdraw funds a couple of months ago. We withheld some of the funds as we had to complete the payment of contractors, ensure like other bills were paid, et cetera. And now the remaining dollars that we have are approximately $246,000, which Ed Corps is now requesting to continue the work that is truly aligned to the board's strategic priorities. Are there any questions?
Questions or comments on this? All right, not hearing any. I thank you very much. I appreciate the work you're doing on these things. We are now at Biz Op 7, our last action on first read, which is a state board policy amendment. The PRC 169 CARES Act gear funds for specialized instructional support personnel, the COVID-19 response, and Alexis Schaus is here to lead us through this.
Thank you, sir. GEAR, which is the Governor's Emergency Education Relief Fund, was authorized as part of the CARES Act back in March of 2020. And the governor provided subgrants to the K-12 public school units out of his authority of these funds. They are federal funds, to be clear. 40 million was approved in September of 2020 to be allocated to the public school units to employ personnel to provide physical and mental health support services for students. And the allocation policy was approved by the state board as Program Report Code PRC 169. Based on the expressed need from the public school units and requested by the governor's office, we are requesting here to expand the allowable use of these funds to not only include the personnel costs, but also to include costs associated with delivering wellness programming and mental health training in accordance with the public school unit's mental health plan. These trainings will be provided to the school level staff and personnel with direct contact with students and families. So the item is being requested, action on first read, to expand the allowable use of these funds.
All right. This obviously is a very important initiative of the board with respect to meeting the mental health welfare of our students and supporting the mental and social and emotional welfare of our students. Are there questions or comments on this? All right, not hearing any. Thank you very much. That brings us to Biz Op 8. Kevin Harrison makes a return appearance. I'm debating between 120 and 180 seconds. I'm kidding. But if we can focus on what's immediately before us, which is the effort about how you get equalization in terms of the comparability of the work, then we can touch on the other as needed.
Certainly. So this is a policy amendment to TRAN-002, and its primary objective is to outline how we will determine equivalent systems between our school bus routing software that we have in 114 LEAs, 113, 114 LEAs, and a different system should an LEA choose to utilize a different school bus routing system. It is a system we've had around since the 80s, although it's been upgraded several times since then. There are no current recurring software costs associated with the software that all the school districts use presently, but there are some recurring costs to DPI in the form of staff to support that software, $450,000 a year. And districts may have some ongoing costs if they choose to utilize some additional technologies associated. If you have a camera system in your school bus, that's going to cost you extra money. If you have real-time access to GPS information, that's going to cost you extra money, but those are local school systems decisions presently. So we're here because primarily statute says that districts must implement TIMS or a system approved by the State Board of Education. And we don't really have a pathway to approve other than to just bring it. So what we wanted to do was outline a few things, which is what they need to do and how they can request to be a system that they choose to become equivalent. And also want to indicate to them fully that any procurement is totally up to them, that they can procure any additional systems which they like at their own discretion, as long as they continue to use the existing system until such time as whatever they have procured is deemed equivalent. So the impetus more specifically is some legislation from last year, which gave Mount Airy City Schools a pilot program of $115,000 to implement new technology for school buses in response to COVID-19. And it included some of that upfront costs for any types of the systems that they would like, including tablets on school buses, cameras, GPS systems, anything that they needed, in addition to ongoing costs associated with whatever their new routing system would be, if indeed they chose a new routing system, and they did. Also, the other bigger push comes from some recent legislation. It's House 256, but could potentially be in a budget somewhere. That includes not really an expansion, but an entirely new pilot program of similar design that could include $15 to $18 million over 3 years. It would be allocated all at once, but it would cover a time period of 3 years through January of 2025, and includes 20 districts, and some rumors include maybe some charter schools as well. So there is the potential for a much larger pilot, which could also result in lots of school districts choosing different systems other than the currently available system, or it may just provide them the funds in order to expand the current system to provide functions that they wish to have. We did bring this up last month, and so I wanted to make sure that we asked for any questions related to either the presentation last month or any of the new information today.
I know it's complicated. Have you drafted a proposed policy for the board's consideration and or whatever procedures would be accompanying that?
Yes, so the proposed policy, Deanna is bringing up now. The proposed policy includes that PSU superintendents would establish the school bus routes in the existing system, the Transportation Information Management System, which is just for us defining what implementation is. But then the second piece indicates that they can choose additional systems or additional technologies if they wish. And if they decide to go with a new routing system, which is the underlying system that the state already provides, then they can do that. But then at such time as they think that the system is equivalent, they can ask, the PSU superintendent can ask the department to approve that system as equivalent, at which point the department would go through three primary phases, three primary reviews, which is we want to make sure that the new system imports the data from our current student information system as we expect it, and as PSUs currently receive it, that the system can provide assistance, electronic assistance. This would be sort of what we would consider now artificial intelligence, but a way for a computer to look at a large number of students and within constraints generate bus routes for those districts. We want to make sure that any system has the capability of assisting PSUs in both documenting and producing school bus routes, because that was the original purpose of the system. And then third, it must output the data and reports that we are expecting. And once it has done those things, we can bring an action to the State Board of Education, present that information, allow you to decide if it is appropriate to extend equivalency to that school district's system.
So this will be coming to the board next time as an action item, now that we've, I think, pretty thoroughly set it out. Are there questions now, or certainly if there are questions during the ensuing month as we prepare for this as an action item? Because it is complicated. The equivalency process is, as Kevin has said to us in the last month, a challenging effort. So any questions, I encourage them if anyone has any. Yes, Dr.
So my
Oxford.
question is pure curiosity.
Sure.
It's a fascinating topic. And my question has to do with the market, the industry itself. So is that a competitive field to find comparable mapping AI?
So I would say that there are several providers out there that are considered primary vendors that market their products specifically in the school bus routing world. There are, of course, a wide array of routing software vendors that service commercial trucking and those types of things, but there are a few primary ones that serve, four that come to mind off the top of my head, that serve the education market specifically.
And a follow-up, if I might. Would our larger systems, our urban systems, have an appetite for this versus our rural systems?
For altering systems or changing to others, I don't know the answer to that question. It started out with, as you see, with the pilot program set forth by the General Assembly in Mount Airy City Schools, which is really one of our smallest school systems in the state. So they were clearly interested in an alternative system. There could be other, I mean, I don't think it is necessarily restricted to a larger school system. There could be an appetite for adopting a different system by many groups.
Thank you.
Superintendent Truett.
And I'll add to that, and then I do have a question. There's a lot of bells and whistles in new software that's available to do this work, and I think that's of interest to districts. So just so I'm clear, next month, we're going to vote on the equivalency criteria itself.
This policy right here, this equivalency criteria in policy, or an outline for how the department should proceed to approve something.
Okay, thank you very much.
We are not going to become the equivalencies determined.
I'll go back to my math courses.
We're going to set the policy for it, and
Then we'll do the math.
any other questions or comments? All right, Kevin, thank you very much. Again, doing a good job making something extremely complicated and bite-sized nuggets, so thank you for that.
Thank you, sir.
All right, Biz Op 9 is a great item. We could spend a lot of time on this. It's a consent item. But in Biz Op, we're used to dealing with expensive contracts, and in this one, we're going to get paid. It's an easement. It's at the School of Deaf in Morganton, and I think the proposal is $63,000 to pay for really have a permanent and temporary easement there. Easements, of course, are some infringement on your property rights, but there's a necessity for this in this instance, and there's an offer been made by Piedmont Natural Gas in order to put this in place. So unless anybody has questions, and if you do, yes, please. Ms. White.
You had to give me the opportunity.
Well, no, you should take it.
So, how, once that payment has been made, thank you, DOT, for that payment of easement, does the board have the discretion to request that the funds be reallocated back to the school itself instead of absorbing that in the department? That those funds could be used directly for a facility improvement or something on that campus?
It's a good question. Ms. Schaus is anxious to try to answer it. I don't know the answer to it, but I think your thought is one where if the money is being generated out of that property, there are capital needs there. Is it not a good idea to keep it there to resolve those capital needs?
There are capital needs there, yes.
Yep.
We will certainly look into the ability to redirect those funds back into the schools.
Very good. And a good question. Any other questions on this? All right. That then brings us on our update on contracts, on our executed contracts report and planned contracts report. I have not received any inquiries to this point. Does anyone have any on any of those contracts? All right. We're rounding down the bend. The agency vacancy report. I know Ron Paxton wanted to report to us specifically on one item for which he's prepared another one of his excellent charts that we've come to expect.
Well, thank you very much. The last two slides, if we can get to the last two slides, because this one feeds into the next one. We look at our vacancy numbers, we're up to 127, which would make you scream and if you didn't understand that we have added 51 new positions since January. So, you know, when we look at where we would have been had we not added those positions, we'd be at about 76 vacancies. So we continue to whittle down that number, and the progress we're making, if you look at the bottom slide, is really what I'm proud of, taking the vacancies over a year old from 33 down to 22. So, and those are continuing to get taken care of. So good news on that slide. And then the next slide, when I talk about all the positions that we added, the question would normally come up, well, how are we doing on those guys? So we look at the 14 positions we added under CARES for the district regional support team. The time we pulled the data, we had 7 filled, 4 in salary admin, no recruitment. To where we are today, we've got 12 filled, 1 under offer, and 1 is being interviewed for. So progress is being made as we continue to work on those positions. The light the way positions are all filled. The ESSER administrative support positions, those 21 positions that we just recently got approved and got funding for and got position numbers for. We show them in pre-recruitment a couple of weeks ago. As of today, we've got 11 of those positions are posted and the other 9 are in pre-recruitment. So just wanted to let you know we are working toward getting those filled, and we've had some good success in getting the other positions filled. So, yes, ma'am.
Yes, Amy.
Where are those positions posted? Are at the bottom of the homepage of the DPI website, there's a
careers,
a link that says, you know, work for DPI. Is that where they would find those?
Yes, ma'am. You would click on that link.
And they're updated how frequently?
As soon as the positions are posted, they're put on there.
And are there positions that are coming about that have not been posted?
There
are not
are,
being posted that you're hiring internally or?
well, I believe of those positions we are posting, of those 21, I believe all 21 of those will be posted externally. I'd have to go back and double check that. 11 of those have been posted and the other 9 are working out some final details before they get posted.
Thank you.
And those are the ones, just for clarification, in the federal programs and administration monitoring and monitoring.
Other questions or comments? All kidding aside, we really appreciate the charts. They're very helpful to keep track of where we are and in the context of the changing environment in the last year. So thank you for it.
It helps us too. I mean, when you can look at the numbers, you can focus on where you need to put your effort. So appreciate the positive comment.
Thank you. And our last item is our second monthly tutorial. As we come to the end of the past budget year, Alexis Schaus is going to talk about a budget item that we have shown interest in the past, which is reversions, which this is the time of year where we talk about reversions. Reversions, just to get the explanation, is very counterintuitive how it works. But as Alexis will explain to us, it's we should expect to be there to be significant reversions, at least what we would think of as significant, and there would be some concern if there weren't. And so that doesn't sound like that's very logical, but it will in a minute. Ms. Schaus.
I hope I can explain it with logic. But yes, today I am going to, as part of this presentation, kind of reflect on this past year, as well as talk about our fiscal year end. Before I do that, I would like to introduce Joyce Monroe, who has joined Financial and Business Services. She joined on July 7th as the Director of Agency Financial Services. Financial and Business Services is made up of the Division of School Business that supports kind of the financial side for the school districts, and then the Agency Financial Services, which is responsible for the DPI budget, which also includes all the public school unit budget at an aggregate level, procurement, contracts, cash management, and general accounting, many of the things that come before you as part of BizOp. Joyce has a very strong background in budget. She served in local government and as the budget director at the City of Raleigh and the director of budget planning, as well as most recently as the assistant dean for business operations for North Carolina State University, the College of Agriculture and Life Sciences. With her experience, specifically in the budget experience, she's made an immediate impact just in the last year on the department, and is already developing plans to implement a more effective budgeting process as we move the department forward. And so she is here. She's standing up. So I am very excited to be working with her, and we've really already started to really get a good plan going forward. So I am still actively recruiting for the Director of School Business. And hope to fill that position in the very near future. So I am no longer a one-man show, which I'm sure you all are thankful for.
If we could just pause for a second and say, welcome, Joyce, on behalf of the board. We are genuinely excited that you're here with us. So
thank you very much. I'm excited as well.
Great.
Thank you.
So as we move on to this presentation, so just reflecting on the 2020-21 year, I mean, everyone knows that this fiscal year was a year like no other. And in the world of North Carolina public school finance, the financial and business services staff, as well as the public school unit finance officers, have just been presented with situations that we would never have imagined. And this actually really goes beyond the COVID funds. We also had a state budget, kind of a different approach, shall we say, to state budget in this past biennium. And, you know, many of you see me here presenting the policies, but after that point, the implementation and the execution of a lot of these items have been I can't even express the challenge that myself and my staff have incurred on a daily basis just to get these funds out. And it does trickle down all the way to the public school units. So looking at the state budget, just one slide just to remind us that we were in the last year was the second year of the biennium. We had a vetoed budget in that first year. So we had this continuation budget plus mini budget bills to implement. Normally what we receive is what we have come to expect is an appropriations bill with an accompanying money report. And that's what we use as kind of a blueprint to move forward. This past year, you can see all the session laws. That was our budget, was kind of sifting through that. And the challenge, and I remember presenting to the board on kind of all these items, the challenge isn't just in the implementation, but when you go forward to the next year and you're trying to kind of do that audit trail, it actually is just, it's hard to even find where things were passed and what the implications, what goes forward, what doesn't. As you're all aware, right now we are in a continuation budget process without a state budget to go forward with, and hopefully we will go back to the kind of one appropriations bill with our money report to help us through. On the federal side, we had our over $6 billion in federal funds coming through, and you can see those major buckets, which really mostly align. The first three items align with the CARES Act, and then we had CRISA and then ARPA, and a lot of those items have come through to you as policies for us to be able to implement. I want to stress that it's not just the magnitude of these funds, which is a challenge, but the number of different programs that these funds go out in make it a significant management and tracking challenge. So, with the CRF, you probably recall all those different line items. Those are still active. They'll be active until the end of this fiscal year. And then all of these funds, they will expire kind of between, actually we had the state emergency money that expired June 30th of last year. And then these funds will expire December 31st of this year. Then we have those that expire in 2022, 23, and 24. So it's all quite a challenge to have done this. And I think it says it's a lot of credit to the department as a whole, not just the financial staff, but also working in collaboration with the program staff. Okay, so I just wanted, before we kind of get into the fiscal year end, I want to kind of provide you a look at the financial and business services staff. We post every month kind of the allotments and the expenditures of all these COVID programs. And in that, Deanna, are you going to go to the, okay. So in that we've historically, probably for the last month, put a workbook out there that you could go to. We have also provided the same information in kind of a more visual form for those that perhaps don't like to see just data tables. For instance, this map here, you can see the dark shaded areas are going to show the areas in the state that got a higher per pupil share of the COVID funds than other areas. We have this, and it's on the FBS website. You can go, we have a designated page for COVID funds. It has all the policies, the board policies that you've provided, some technical support information, as well as this visualization. There is different areas that you can actually go down and see how any public school unit is expending each of the program funds. So you'll be able to see, are they expending on personnel, on technology, on school nutrition, etc. It is provided, we in finance do tend to be a little bit logic and perhaps dry at times. And so this was our first iteration of kind of trying to provide it so that other stakeholders will be able to digest the information, because with all those programs, and of course over 300 public school units. It's a lot of data. So hopefully that is helpful to you. I just wanted to let you know, and for the public to know that that is out there, so that there is full transparency on the use of these funds. And as I said, it is updated on a monthly basis. Okay, so going back to reversions. So just so you know, reversions is the difference between budgeted and actual expenditures, and then of course excluding items that can carry over. And the way I put that, the reason I put that is because often people will think of this reversions as unspent money that was provided and then school districts didn't expend. So I think it's a very important kind of statement just to provide that to you. Here's a history of our state fund reversions, and you can see that it's $150 million, which many would say that, wow, that's a whole lot of money. It is. However, historically, our reversions are between about 1% and 2%. This past year was at about that 1.5%. We do not get comfortable if it goes below that 1%. There is kind of that buffer. 1%, when you think about it, is not a very high margin of error. And you'll see as we talk about how these reversions are created, a lot of it is at the state level budgeting. And so, I like my job, and I don't want to be walked out of the building because we got a little too tight. So anyway. So how are these reversions created? Well, 65% of the state public school fund budget goes out in the form of positions. And I'm sure many of you are aware that North Carolina is quite unique in this, in that the school districts are provided positions, not necessarily a dollar value. They hire the positions, they pay them off the state salary schedule, and the state covers that position. So where this comes into budgeting is that we are budgeting at that average for all those positions, those 78,000 classroom teacher and CTE positions. We budget at that high level. And of course, with a large number, there's not huge swings in our population, right? If everyone with 10 years above left and we got in a whole bunch of brand new teachers, of course, our average would go down, but that it doesn't occur, right? It tends to be at that level, quite stable. And so we're able to manage that. But the reversions, which is a significant amount of the percentage of that 150 million, is from that differential of what we're budgeting and then that actual. The second item where we receive our reversions is what's called a guaranteed allotments. There are items that are kind of in benefits, for instance, such as longevity, where we don't actually allocate out dollars to the school districts. We tell the school districts you have to provide this benefit to your employees if they meet that, that 5 or 10 years, I guess it's 10 years of state service. And then when you charge that, the state will cover the expenditure. So mostly the things which come under these guaranteed allotments are items which are very hard to calculate as to what each school district would need to cover those benefits. So instead, they pay for the benefits and then we manage that budget at the state level. Again, generally, there aren't huge swings between line items for these guaranteed allotments. But if there were, we also do have authority provided to us that we have enjoyed to realign our budgets to cover one shortage with another area that we have. And the following slide will just provide you an examples of some of these items, which probably, hopefully, based on the explanation I just provided, kind of makes sense. It would be hard for the state to know how many people in Caswell County are going to be on short-term disability. So or how many people in Mitchell County are going to leave this year. So that is how that what the process is for that. The other item, which is probably a little bit more significant this year, is we had some allocations that due to COVID, the school districts weren't really able to utilize. The state law prohibits the school districts from transferring those funds from one program to another so that they could use them for a different purpose. So an example of this might be driver's education or the school resource officer grants. Some of those individuals, they did not employ those, they did not utilize the grants they had because students were not in the building. And another item is that some allocations are very, very restricted to their purpose. For instance, a school district may receive a specific grant for a specific very high needs student. And then if that student leaves, the funds are there and they are not permitted to utilize. They are very restricted. And then finally, what is the line items of unspent funds. And you can see it was about $12 million that was unspent. But this line also includes those areas which I just spoke about, where they are restricted or they were unable to use the funds because of COVID. But regardless, we're looking at 0.13% of their total, the value of their allocations. So it is a very, very small percentage when we're talking about the public schools as a whole. When you're looking at the different areas by this list is providing kind of those areas that the unspent allotment was greater than $500,000. And you'll see there that we had the school safety grants. That was because of the SROs. Transportation was another area. Some school districts did move those, transfer those funds into different areas to utilize the funds, and some did not. And then driver's training would make sense. That program was in many areas on hold, specifically the driving portion. And the other two areas just came up also. So we also do have carry forward items. We request every year from the state budget office for carry forward of funds. And these are the major items that go out to public schools. There are some other small items that that the department will ask, maybe some encumbered items that they have requested from the state budget office to have those funds available to clear those expenditures. The summer reading camp and at-risk by law, they do carry forward, and you can see the expiration date. And then the 3 CTE programs that also have carry forward authority. So in the total, it was $87 million. I will state that that is much higher than in prior years. Specifically, the at-risk allotment was much higher this year. Many school districts carried over funds that they don't normally do in the at-risk, and I'm sure that is in response to the COVID, as well as having the summer learning program. So they had a defined program to utilize those funds during the summer. So as we look ahead, we are anticipating a 2022 ratified budget that we can enjoy and implement. And then also we are waiting, the other significant item is waiting for the approval of the ESSA 3 leadership funds that are still outstanding. And then I am sure, no doubt, with both of those items, we will be coming before you for new policies, changes to salary manuals, etc. In the meantime, as I stated, we are on a continuation. We have proceeded with a different method within financial and business services in order to avoid any bottlenecking of allocations. If we waited, we feared that there would be a lot of bottlenecking of the funds coming or hitting in September, October. So we've kind of had to look a little bit more creatively. In the short term, it will allow the flow of funds to the school districts. In the longer term, well, it's duplicating our efforts in short. But I feel it's the right decision of how to proceed, considering we are in August without that state budget.
Thank you very much. Questions or comments about our this month's budget tutorial? Under the instruction of Professor Schaus. All right, not hearing any thank yous was very helpful. I want to thank everybody who presented. There's some complex subject matter today, and everyone did a really good job of presenting. And thank you for all the work that's going into it, making sure behind the scenes the operations are working well in a very complicated time. So we give great thanks and turn it back to you, Chair Davis.
Thank you, Vice Chair Duncan. That concludes our work for today. I appreciate everyone's work making today a success. I now ask for a motion to go into closed session, and note for the audience and online listeners that following closed session, the August 4th, 2021 meeting will adjourn immediately. Vice Chair Duncan.
I move that we go into closed session pursuant to North Carolina General Statute Section 143-318.11A1, 3, and 6 to prevent the disclosure of information that is privileged or confidential pursuant to North Carolina General Statute Sections 115C-319 and -321, and to consult with our attorneys in order to preserve the attorney-client privilege between the attorneys and the public body, including specifically to consider the case of Hoke County Board of Education et al. Versus the state of North Carolina, and to consider the qualifications, competence, performance, or condition of appointment of public officers or employees or prospective public officers or employees.
Motion by Vice Chair Duncan. Is there a second? Second by Ms. White. Dr. Townsend Smith.
Sir.
Yes.
Chemnitz. Yes. Mr. Keenan.
Yes.
Hall.
Yes.
Tipton Rogers.
Yes.
Ms. White.
Yes.
Ford.
Yes.
Falwell. Lieutenant Governor. Vice Chair Duncan.
Yes.
Yes. Motion carries. Let's take a 10-minute break and be in closed session by 4:45. 4:45. And if you're in the room, if you could stand by.